The Emperor had been inside her mind for 3 years before she finally understood what that meant. Not in the way that power works, not orders, not commands, not a voice telling her what to do. It was deeper than that. He had settled into her, the way cold settles into stone in winter, slowly, completely, until the stone and the cold are no longer two separate things and you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. She could feel his intentions before he formed them into thoughts. She could sense his focus shifting across the galaxy, the way you sense a change in the weather before the clouds arrive. She was not his apprentice in any traditional sense. She was something closer to an extension of him. A hand that could move through the galaxy, while the rest of him stayed perfectly still on Dromund Kaas, patient and ancient and waiting. Her name was Exal Kressh. She was Sith Pureblood, a direct descendant of one of the oldest bloodlines in the entire Empire. The name Kresh meant something once. It meant Ludo Kressh, who had challenged for dominance over the Sith Empire and lost. It meant a bloodline that had survived defeat by becoming useful. By the time Exal was born, House Kresh was a shadow of what it had been, respected enough to be watched, diminished enough to be controlled. The Emperor had looked at that bloodline and seen something worth taking for himself. So he took it. He performed a ritual that the Sith texts call the Emperor's Children, conditioning a process that bound a chosen individual so completely to the Emperor's will that the line between master and servant stopped being a line at all. He had done it before. He would do it again. Exal Kressh was simply the most complete version of it he had ever achieved. The most thoroughly prepared, the deepest conditioned. And then she ran. This is the part of the story that the official records cannot explain. Not because the facts are missing. The facts, scattered and sealed as they are, can be assembled if you know where to look. She left Dromund Kaas. She crossed into Republic space. She moved fast, changing routes constantly, using methods that suggested she understood exactly how Imperial hunters track defectors. She was heading somewhere specific. She had something specific she needed to do. But here is what makes this remarkable. She did not run to wild space, where the Emperor's reach grows thin and a person can disappear for decades without anyone finding them. She did not run to the outer rim, to some forgotten station at the edge of nothing where she could have lived out the rest of her life in comfortable obscurity. She ran toward the Republic, toward the Jedi, toward the people who had every reason in the galaxy to destroy her the moment she came within lightsaber range. She was Sith Pureblood. She had served the Emperor personally. She had done things in that service that no document we can access will describe in detail. Her face and her bloodline and her years at the Emperor's side marked her as an enemy before she opened her mouth. She ran toward them anyway. And that single decision, that one choice made somewhere on Dromund Kaas when she finally understood what she was carrying and what it meant, is the thread that pulls this entire story forward. Because Exal Kressh did not run like someone trying to save herself. She ran like someone trying to deliver something before the delivery became impossible. She ran like someone who had already accepted the cost. Now you need to understand what she was running from. Because without that, nothing else in this story makes sense. The Sith Emperor, the being sitting at the center of the empire that had been building its strength in the unknown regions for 1,000 years, the being who had orchestrated the return of the Sith to the known galaxy, the being who had just signed a peace treaty with the Republic that everyone on both sides understood to be a pause rather than an ending, was not interested in conquest. Not in the way that word normally works. He was not building an empire to rule it. He was not accumulating armies and fleets because he wanted territory. What he was building toward was something that had no real precedent in any war or conflict that had come before it. He intended to consume the galaxy, not defeat it, not dominate it, consume it, draw all life, all light, everything the Force had ever touched into himself in a single act, so total that the word catastrophe is not large enough to describe it. And Exal Kressh was going to be part of how it started. The Emperor had not chosen her for proximity out of preference. He had chosen her because she was going to be one of the vessels through which his essence would flow outward into the galaxy when the time came. The conditioning process, the ritual, the 3 years of having his consciousness threaded through hers was preparation. She was not his apprentice. She was his instrument, one of many. And the thing about instruments is that they are not told what the music is for. She found out anyway. The Emperor's presence had been living in her mind long enough that his thoughts had become almost indistinguishable from her own, and that closeness, that terrifying intimacy, eventually worked against him. Because she had access to enough of what he actually intended that she could not pretend not to understand it. She saw the full shape of what was coming. She saw what the Empire was really being built for. She saw what she was really being prepared for. And she made a decision. Exal Kressh did not make that decision quietly or safely, or from a position of any strength at all. She made it on Dromund Kaas, inside the Emperor's own fortress, surrounded by the full machinery of the Sith Empire. She made it knowing that the moment she moved, the Dark Council would send someone after her. She made it knowing that running toward the Republic meant running toward people who would probably try to kill her before she got 2 sentences out. She made it knowing that the Emperor's conditioning ran so deep inside her that she could not be certain, even as she ran, that some part of what she was doing was not exactly what he wanted. That last part is the most brutal thing about her situation. She had been so thoroughly bound to another person's mind that she could not fully trust her own decisions. Every choice she made passed through the shadow of his presence. Every instinct she acted on had been shaped by years of conditioning. Even the act of running, was that her? Or was it something he had built into her, some safeguard, some plan she was executing without knowing she was executing it? She ran anyway, because the alternative was doing nothing. And doing nothing meant becoming exactly what he had made her to be. She stole a holocron before she left a small hexagonal device, dark red crystal matrix, containing partial records of the Emperor's children conditioning protocols, evidence. Something she could use to show the Jedi what was being done, what was being prepared, what was coming. She put it inside her coat, and she walked out of Dromund Kaas, and she did not look back. Now here is where the story gets complicated. The Dark Council convened almost immediately after her disappearance was confirmed. These were the 12 most powerful Sith Lords in the Empire, the ruling body that governed imperial affairs and answered, ultimately, only to the Emperor himself. Their deliberations from this period are partially recovered, and they contain a phrase that is worth sitting with. They described Exal Kressh as the most comprehensively prepared of the Emperor's children. Think about what that means coming from the Dark Council. These were not people who gave compliments. These were not people who acknowledged strength in enemies, unless the strength was impossible to deny. And they called the woman they were hunting the most comprehensively prepared vessel the Emperor had ever produced. Then they sent a barely trained Sith warrior to bring her down. His name was Kel. He was young, underpowered by any measure. The Dark Council normally applied to missions of this importance and connected to Exal Kressh through the same Emperor's Children program, which meant he could theoretically track her through the Force in ways that a conventional hunter could not. He was the most practical choice available. He was also, by any reasonable assessment, completely outmatched by the woman he was supposed to stop. The Dark Council sent him anyway. This tells you something important about how they understood the situation. They did not send Teneb Kel because they thought he could defeat Exal Kressh in a fair fight. They sent him because they needed her stopped before she reached the Jedi, and they needed the mission carried out by someone whose connection to her might give him a chance of finding her before it was too late. The outcome of the fight was secondary to the urgency of the timeline. She had to be stopped before she delivered what she was carrying. She almost made it. That is the fact that sits at the center of everything that follows. Not that she failed. Everyone who has ever examined this story focuses on the failure. What deserves attention is how close she came to succeeding. She crossed from Imperial space into Republic territory. She moved through systems that should have been impossible for a lone Sith defector to navigate without detection. She made contact partial, fragmentary, insufficient, but real contact with people on the Republic side who were beginning to understand that something significant was happening. She was getting there. And then Teneb Kel found her. The trail he followed to reach her is not something the records describe in any useful detail. What we know is that he tracked her across Republic space and caught up with her on a station suspended above a gas giant at the edge of the Leno system. A small place, an unremarkable place. The kind of place that exists at the intersections of trade routes that were once more important than they currently are, kept alive by inertia and the occasional cargo ship rather than by any genuine commercial vitality. Leno Station. She did not choose it because it was safe. She chose it because she had run out of options that were further away. The fight happened in the mid-ring residential block, Corridor 3. We do not have a detailed account of it. Teneb Kel's mission report describes it the way mission reports describe things that the author wants the reader to stop thinking about as quickly as possible. She resisted. She was eliminated. Mission parameters were met. The report is 4 sentences describing a confrontation that changed the shape of the next 40 years without anyone on either side fully understanding that it had. What the report does not say. It does not say what she told him before it ended. It does not say whether she fought him the way someone fights when they are trying to survive, or whether she fought him the way someone fights when they are trying to buy enough time for something else to happen. It does not say what she was doing in those last minutes, whether she was still trying to make contact with someone, still trying to get the knowledge to somewhere useful, still running the delivery even as the delivery was failing. It does not say what Teneb Kel found on her body when it was done. It does not mention the holocron at all. But we know he found it, because it survived. Because decades later, it appeared in Republic hands, traceable back through a chain of custody that begins, if you follow it far enough, with a young Sith warrior standing in a corridor on Leno Station and making a quiet decision to put something in his pocket rather than leave it behind or destroy it. He picked it up without examining it. He put it in his coat. He filed a 4-sentence report. And he left. The station above Leno Prime has fewer than 400 permanent residents now. It was built for 1,200. The corridors in the outer rings echo the way corridors echo when they were designed for more life than they currently contain. The docking fees cover basic maintenance. The life support runs. The lights stay on. The station continues in the way that forgotten places continue, not because anyone is actively sustaining them, but because no one has yet made a formal decision to let them end. There is one corridor in the mid-ring residential block where the residents do not walk if they can help it. They give reasons when asked. The lighting is unreliable there. The ventilation makes a sound they cannot identify. These explanations are true as far as they go. But a dock worker who spent 11 years on that station, 11 years before he left and never returned, described it differently when asked about it, long after he had gone. He said it felt like a room where someone had been interrupted in the middle of saying something important. He said that whatever they had been trying to say was still in there, still trying to get out. He was not wrong. The floor of that corridor holds a discoloration that no cleaning ever fully removed, dark red at the center, spreading outward at the edges in the shape that liquid makes when it falls, and the surface underneath it decides to hold on. 3 replacement panels, all of them warped. Eventually, someone filed a maintenance note that read simply, "Cosmetic repair, deprioritized." The stain is still there. Exal Kressh died in that corridor, trying to deliver something the galaxy needed to hear. She did not finish saying it. And the station, small and unremarkable, and slowly emptying of the people who once gave it purpose, has been holding that unfinished sentence ever since. Now here is what you need to understand about the galaxy she left behind. The peace that followed the Great War, the Treaty of Coruscant, signed by both sides from positions of exhaustion and calculation rather than any genuine desire for resolution, is approximately 15 years old at the point from which this account is being told. The Republic rebuilt what it could. The Jedi relocated to Tython. The Empire settled into its territories with the particular patience of something that has been waiting a very long time and is comfortable waiting a little longer. The Emperor is still there, still patient, still planning, still carrying the intention that Exal Kressh died trying to warn the galaxy about. She was 43 years ahead of where the understanding currently sits. She saw what was coming before almost anyone else in the galaxy had the information to see it. She ran toward the one place she thought might be able to use what she knew, and she almost reached it, and then she did not. And the galaxy moved on without ever fully understanding what it had lost in that corridor. But here is the thing about almost. Almost is not nothing. Almost leaves traces. Almost sends things moving in directions that take years to become visible. The chain of events that Exal Kressh started when she walked out of Dromund Kaas with a holocron in her coat did not end in Corridor 3 on Leno Station. It continued through the people who were shaped by her death, through the object she carried, through the partial knowledge that leaked into Republic awareness, despite everything the Empire did to prevent it. She thought she had failed completely. She was wrong about that, but she never lived to find out. The gas giant below Leno Station turns in its slow way tonight. Great bands of amber and pale green, moving in patterns that take years to complete a single cycle. The station rotates above it. The viewports in the mid-ring catch the light from below every few hours, filling the corridors with something soft and diffuse and very old. Corridor 3 is empty. It is almost always empty. The floor holds what it absorbed. The walls hold their silence. The ventilation moves air through the section with its low, unidentifiable hum, a sound that has no documented source, that maintenance crews have checked and rechecked and filed reports about and ultimately stopped trying to explain. 43 years. That is how long the station has been holding this. The gas giant does not care. The planet was here before the station, and will be here after it. Its cloud bands have been moving since long before Exal Kressh was born, and will still be moving long after the last resident of Leno Station finds a reason to leave. But the corridor remembers. And what it remembers is a woman who understood something terrifying, who chose to run toward danger rather than away from it, who almost delivered the most important warning in a generation, and who died in a small, unremarkable place far from home before she could finish the sentence. In the next chapter, we turn to the only man who was there when it ended. He filed a 4-sentence report. He kept the holocron. He spent the next 40 years carefully not thinking about what he heard in that corridor before the fight began. He became Darth Thanitin. And the thing he refused to carry forward from that day shaped everything that came after, including, eventually, his own destruction. Teneb Kel was not supposed to survive this mission. Not officially, the Dark Council did not send him out there expecting him to die. But practically, when you look at what they asked him to do, and who they asked him to do it against, the math does not work in his favor. He was young. He was undertrained by any standard the Sith Empire normally applied to missions of this sensitivity. He had a slave, a companion named Qual who traveled with him, and a ship, and the theoretical ability to track Exal Kressh through the Force because of the conditioning they had both undergone. That was his entire advantage. One thin thread of connection through a shared experience that neither of them had chosen. The Dark Council sent him anyway. And this is the first thing worth understanding about Teneb Kel's account before we look at what he reported, before we look at what he left out, before we look at the small, quiet decision he made at the end of it that changed everything. The Dark Council chose him specifically because he was connected to her, not because he was powerful enough to stop her, because he was linked to her through the Emperor's conditioning in a way that gave him a chance of finding her before she reached someone who could actually use what she was carrying. The mission was never really about the fight. It was about the timeline. She had to be stopped before she delivered the knowledge. Everything else, Teneb's survival, the nature of the confrontation, what happened in the corridor afterward, was secondary to that single requirement. Stop her before she talks. Stop her before the Jedi understand what she is trying to tell them. Everything after that point is details. The chase took weeks. Teneb Kel tracked her across Republic space, using the Force connection between them, a thin, unreliable signal that he described in his notes as feeling like following smoke through wind. She was moving fast. She was changing routes in patterns that demonstrated she understood exactly how Imperial hunters worked, which made sense given that she had spent years working alongside those same hunters. She knew their methods because she had used their methods. Every trick the Empire had for tracking defectors, she had helped develop or refine or deploy against someone else. She was not running blind. She was running with full knowledge of what was behind her, and she was still heading somewhere specific. This is the detail in Teneb Kel's own notes that most people overlook because it sits between two more dramatic pieces of information and is easy to pass by without stopping. He wrote, and this is his own language, from the partial notes that survived, that she was not moving like someone trying to escape. She was moving like someone trying to reach a destination. There is a difference, and Teneb Kel noticed it, and then he filed a mission report that did not include it. He noticed something important about what she was doing, and he chose not to put it in the official record. We will come back to that. He found her on Leno Station, the station above Leno Prime, suspended over the gas giant in the Leno system, small and unremarkable, and positioned at the intersection of trade routes that had seen better decades. She had not chosen it because it was safe. She had chosen it because she had exhausted the options that were further away. Whatever destination she had been moving toward, she had not reached it yet. She was still in transit, still running the knowledge towards somewhere it could be used. And then Teneb Kell arrived. His account of the actual confrontation is 4 sentences long. 4 sentences describing a fight between 2 emperor's children, 2 people who had been conditioned by the same ritual, bound to the same consciousness, shaped by the same process, in a corridor on a forgotten station, above a gas giant that most of the galaxy had never heard of. 4 sentences that tell you almost nothing about what actually happened in that corridor, and everything about what Teneb Kell needed the Dark Council to believe had happened. He reported that she resisted. He did not report what she said while she was resisting. He reported that she was eliminated per mission parameters. He did not report what she was trying to do when she was eliminated. He reported that the mission was complete. He did not report what he found when it was over. Now here is where the account gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the gaps in Teneb Kell's report are not random. They are not the gaps of someone who was in a hurry or someone who found the paperwork tedious. They are specific, targeted. Each absence in the record corresponds to a piece of information that would have changed how the Dark Council understood what had just happened, and more importantly, would have changed what they asked him next. She resisted, but what did she say while she was resisting? We do not know. Teneb Kell did not report it. But we know she said something because people in her situation always say something. People who have run across Republic space for weeks, carrying knowledge they believe can change the outcome of a galactic catastrophe, do not go quietly when the person who found them is someone they were conditioned alongside. They talk, they argue, they try one last time to make the person in front of them understand what is at stake. She would have talked, and Teneb Kell heard it. And then he filed a 4-sentence report that did not mention a single word she said. This is the point in the account where the unanswerable question has to be named. Not because naming it answers anything, it does not, but because everything that follows every chapter of this story, every piece of evidence, every trace that Exal Kressh left behind in people and places and objects only makes full sense if you are holding this question while you examine it. Did she know she was not going to survive? Not in the abstract way that anyone running from the Empire knows they might be caught. Not in the general sense of danger that every defector accepts when they make the decision to run. But specifically in those final weeks, in the specific shape of what she was doing and how she was doing it, did Exal Kressh understand that she was not going to make it to the destination she was running toward? And if she did understand that if she had already accepted somewhere along the way that she was not getting out of this, then what does that change about what she was doing? Because here is the thing about the route she was taking. It was not the safest route to Republic space. It was not the route someone takes when their primary goal is survival. It was the route someone takes when their primary goal is visibility, when they want to be moving through places where people will notice them, where the signal they are generating will be picked up by the right kind of attention, where even if they never reach their destination, the attempt itself creates enough noise that something leaks through. Was she running toward the Jedi? Or was she running the knowledge toward them using her own movement, her own pursuit, her own death, if necessary, as the delivery mechanism? Betting that even if Teneb Kell stopped her before she finished saying what she needed to say, The noise of the chase would have already done something, would have already planted something in the awareness of people who were paying attention. We cannot answer this. Teneb Kel is the only person who was close enough to her in those final days to know. And Teneb Kel filed a 4-sentence report. His later career tells us something, though. Teneb Kel did not remain Teneb Kel. He returned from Leno station, delivered his mission report, and was elevated, rewarded for his success, granted status, given the resources to continue building his power within the Sith hierarchy. He took the name Darth Thanitin. He rose through the ranks with a focus and a methodical intensity that his contemporaries found either impressive or unsettling depending on how close they were to him. He became a master of Sith sorcery. He accumulated knowledge and influence, and eventually a seat on the very dark council that had sent him after Exal Kressh as a barely trained afterthought. By any external measure, Teneb Kel became exactly what the Sith Empire rewarded people for becoming. But look at the specific shape of his beliefs. Look at the particular things Darth Thanitin committed himself to, with an intensity that went beyond professional interest into something closer to personal necessity. He was a passionate defender of Sith orthodoxy, of the traditional structures, the traditional hierarchies, the traditional understanding of what the Emperor was and what the Empire was for. He rejected any suggestion that the Emperor's nature was more complicated than the official position allowed. He responded to challenges to imperial orthodoxy, not with the calm confidence of someone who has examined the question and found it settled, but with the specific fury of someone who has decided the question must not be examined. That is not the behavior of a true believer. That is the behavior of someone who knows something and has decided never to look at it directly. Darth Thanitin spent 40 years being shaped by what he refused to carry forward from that corridor on Leno station. Everything he became the orthodoxy, the fury, the particular blindness that would eventually contribute to his own destruction, traced back to a conversation he had in a fight he filed 4 sentences about. He heard what she said. He chose not to know it, and that choice followed him for the rest of his life. There is one more thing about Teneb Kel's account that deserves attention before we leave it. When the fight in Corridor 3 was over, when Exal Kressh was dead and the mission was technically complete, and all that remained was the report and the journey back to Dromund Kaas, Teneb Kel searched the body. This is standard. This is procedure. A defector running across Republic space for weeks is almost certainly carrying something, and that something belongs to the Empire. He found the holocron. Small, hexagonal, dark red crystal matrix. The gatekeeper corrupted, no active voice, no projectable image, just data. Partial records of the Emperor's children conditioning protocols. Evidence of exactly what Exal Kressh had been trying to deliver to the Jedi. The thing she had stolen from Dromund Kaas and carried across Republic space and protected through weeks of pursuit and was still carrying when she died in that corridor. Standard procedure is to document it, log it, return it to Imperial custody for evaluation and disposition. Teneb Kel did not document it. He did not log it. He picked it up, held it for a moment without looking at it directly the way you pick up something you are not ready to examine, and put it inside his coat. It does not appear in the mission report. It does not appear in any inventory of items recovered from the scene. It does not appear in any Imperial record we have been able to find. As far as the official account is concerned, Exal Kressh was carrying nothing when she died. Teneb Kel kept it. He never explained why. He never referenced it in any document we have access to. Whether it sat in a drawer somewhere on Dromund Kaas for the next 4 decades, whether he looked at it once and put it away and never touched it again, whether he understood what he was holding or deliberately chose not to find out, none of that is in the record. What is in the record is what came next, what the holocron eventually became, where it eventually went. How it eventually ended up in the hands of people who were trying, decades later, to understand something that Exal Kressh had already understood and died trying to communicate. But that part of the story comes later. For now, Teneb Kel put the holocron in his coat. He walked out of Corridor 3. He left Leno Station. He filed 4 sentences about what had happened and said nothing about what he had taken. And the corridor held its silence. And the floor held its stain. And somewhere inside a coat pocket on a ship, heading back to Dromund Kaas, a small dark hexagonal device sat in the dark and waited, carrying everything Exal Kressh had tried to give the galaxy. Patient in the way that objects are patient, which is to say completely and without any awareness of the waiting at all. Dromund Kaas does not forget easily. This is not a metaphor. It is a description of the planet itself, a world so saturated with the dark side of the Force that the atmosphere crackles with it, that the storms that roll in from the jungle never fully leave, that the darkness between the city lights feels thicker than darkness has any right to feel. The Sith Empire rebuilt its capital here after 1,000 years of exile, and in the centuries since, the planet has absorbed everything that happened on it, the way the floor of Leno Station absorbed what was spilled there. It holds things, it keeps them. The Emperor's citadel sits at the heart of Kaas City, enormous and dark, and designed to communicate one thing above all others, that the power inside it is absolute, and has always been absolute, and will continue to be absolute long after every person currently living has become part of the planet's history. It is the physical expression of the Emperor's will made into architecture. Every corridor, every chamber, every sealed room in its upper tiers was built to remind anyone standing inside it of exactly where they stood in relation to everything else. Exal Kressh walked those corridors for 3 years. She is not there anymore. Her name was removed from the residential assignment records within days of her defection. Her quarters were sealed. The people who passed her in those corridors do not speak her name now, not because they have been forbidden to, though they probably have been, but because the Empire's relationship with failure is essentially the same as its relationship with weakness. You do not discuss it. You do not acknowledge it. You move forward as though the person who failed never existed, because their existence is now a liability, and liabilities are not useful. The rooms are still there, though. To understand what those rooms meant, you have to understand what it meant to be the Emperor's personal apprentice at the level Exal Kressh occupied. This was not a standard Sith apprenticeship. The normal Sith structure: a master takes an apprentice, trains them, eventually either produces a capable Sith Lord or is killed by the apprentice, as demonstration of that capability did not apply to what Exal Kressh was. She was not being trained to become a Sith Lord. She was not being prepared to take her place in the hierarchy, accumulate her own power, carve out her own domain within the Empire's structure. She was being prepared for something specific and singular, and not discussed in any document that circulated below the highest levels of imperial authority. The Emperor's children, the small group of individuals chosen for the conditioning ritual, bound to the Emperor's consciousness, threaded through with his presence, occupied a category that the Sith hierarchy did not have clean language for. They were not apprentices in the traditional sense. They were not lords. They were not servants in the way that servants are understood, because servants have a defined role within a structure, and what the emperor's children were being shaped into did not fit any structure that existed. They were vessels. Whether they knew this at the beginning varies by account and by individual. Some of the emperor's children seem to have understood relatively early what the conditioning was actually for. Others moved through years of service, believing something more comfortable, that the proximity to the emperor was an honor, that the conditioning was a form of elevated training, that they were being prepared for leadership rather than consumption. Exal Kressh was in the second group for most of her time in the citadel. She believed, for 2.5 years, that she had been chosen because she was exceptional. The quarters assigned to the emperor's personal apprentices sit in the upper residential tier of the citadel, above the standard Sith Lord accommodations, below the emperor's own levels, in a section of the building that is accessible only through specific corridors that require clearances most imperial citizens never achieve. The rooms themselves are not extravagant in the way that power sometimes expresses itself through excess. They are precise, controlled, every object in them placed deliberately. Every surface clean in the specific way that surfaces are clean, when the people responsible for cleaning them understand that imprecision is not acceptable. There is a room in that tier upper residential, north-facing, third door from the corridor junction that has been sealed since Exal Kressh left. Not reassigned. Sealed. The distinction matters. Reassignment would mean the Empire had processed her departure, catalogued her space, determined that someone else could use it. Sealing means the room sits in a category that no one has formally addressed. It is not available. It is not occupied. It simply exists in a state of administrative suspension that has lasted, at the point from which this account is being told, for somewhere between 3 and 4 years. The official reason for the sealing is not documented anywhere we can access. The practical reason is more obvious if you think about it from the perspective of whoever is responsible for imperial residential management. Reassigning a room means explaining what happened to the previous occupant. Explaining what happened means acknowledging that the previous occupant existed. Acknowledging that the previous occupant existed means acknowledging that the emperor's most thoroughly conditioned vessel chose to run rather than serve. It is much simpler to seal the room and file no paperwork about it. The room sits in the dark. The climate systems maintain the temperature, because the climate systems do not distinguish between occupied and sealed spaces. The corridor outside it receives foot traffic from imperial personnel who pass it daily without looking at it directly, the way people avoid looking at things they have been trained not to notice. Now, here is where the history of House Kresh becomes essential. Because you cannot understand what the Emperor's attention meant to Exal Kressh without understanding where that attention found her. Ludo Kressh was one of the most powerful Sith Lords of the Great Hyperspace War era, the period roughly 1,000 years before Exal's time, when the Sith Empire first made contact with the Republic, and the resulting conflict nearly destroyed both sides. He challenged for supremacy over the Sith Empire against Naga Sadow, his primary rival. He lost. His forces were scattered. His authority collapsed. His bloodline survived, because bloodlines with enough political weight tend to survive even catastrophic defeats. They simply become smaller, quieter, more careful about how they express what they once were. By the time the Empire rebuilt itself on Dromund Kaas and began the long process of preparation that would eventually produce the Great War, House Kresh was a fraction of its former significance. It held enough history to command a certain formal respect. It held enough diminishment to be non-threatening. This is a very specific position to occupy within the Sith hierarchy, significant enough to be noticed, reduced enough to be safe to overlook. Exal Kressh grew up in that position. She grew up knowing the weight of a name that had once meant something enormous and now meant something smaller. She grew up understanding the gap between what her bloodline had been and what it currently was. And she grew up as all Force-sensitive purebloods of her generation grew up in the awareness that the Emperor's attention, if it fell on you, could change everything. When it fell on her, she believed it had. The conditioning process that the Emperor used on his children is not described in any document we have full access to. What we can piece together from the edges of the account, from the behavior it produced, from the specific nature of what it did to the people who underwent it, suggests that it was not a single ritual but an extended process, something that happened over months, possibly years. Something that worked gradually, the way long exposure to anything works, through accumulation rather than dramatic transformation. The Emperor would have started small, a presence at the edges of awareness, a sense of connection that felt like enhanced perception, like the Force opening new channels. For someone like Exal Kressh, young, powerful, from a bloodline that had spent a century learning to value the Emperor's attention above almost anything else, this would have felt like elevation, like confirmation that the choice to serve had been the right choice. The deeper it went, the more it would have felt like her own thoughts. This is what makes the conditioning so complete and so difficult to recognize from the inside. It does not announce itself. It does not feel like intrusion. It settles in gradually until the thoughts that are his and the thoughts that are hers become genuinely difficult to distinguish, until she is making decisions that serve his purposes while believing she is acting on her own understanding and her own judgment. For 2.5 years, she lived inside this and called it home. What changed? We do not know the specific moment. The record does not preserve it. But the shape of what followed tells us something about the nature of the change. It was not a sudden revelation. It was not a single piece of information that broke through the conditioning and revealed everything at once. That is not how minds work, and the conditioning was specifically designed to prevent that kind of clean break. What it appears to have been based on the timeline, based on the route she took when she ran, based on the specific thing she was carrying when Teneb Kel found her, was a gradual accumulation. The Emperor's presence in her mind gave her access to things she was not supposed to have access to. His thoughts, his intentions, the true shape of what he was building toward. This access was probably not deliberate. He was not showing her these things because he wanted her to know them. It was the inevitable consequence of threading his consciousness through hers so completely. When you are that deeply inside someone's mind, some of what you are carrying leaks through. She started understanding things she had not been told, and once she understood them, she could not un-understand them. The conditioning was designed to make her serve. It was not designed to make her believe that service was good. Those are different things, and the gap between them, the gap between compliance and conviction, is where Exal Kressh found room to make a different choice. She understood what she was being prepared for. She walked out. The room in the upper residential tier of the Emperor's citadel is still sealed. If you could stand in the corridor outside it, and you cannot, the clearances required are not available to anyone conducting historical research. And the Empire does not grant access to sealed spaces in its most secured facility. For any reason, you would feel the Dromund Kaas atmosphere doing what it does everywhere on this planet, pressing, heavy. The dark side saturated into the walls, and the air and the stone floors the way it saturates everything on this world, accumulated over centuries of the Empire's occupation and the Emperor's presence and the sheer weight of what has happened here. But in this specific corridor, outside this specific door, there is something underneath the general saturation that is harder to name, something that the Force holds in places where significant understanding occurred. Not power, not darkness specifically, something more like the residue of a moment when a person who had been thoroughly shaped by someone else's intentions looked at those intentions clearly for the first time and decided that the shaping had been wrong. The moment she understood what she was. The moment she decided she was going to run. That moment happened somewhere in this part of the building. In the room, or in the corridor, or in one of the adjacent spaces where the Emperor's personal apprentices moved through their daily routines of service and presence, and the careful maintenance of proximity to something vast and ancient and willing to consume them. When the time came, the room holds it. The Dromund Kaas stone holds it. The Empire sealed the door and filed no paperwork, and moved forward the way the Empire always moves forward without looking at the things that complicate the story it needs to tell about itself. But the room is still there, and what happened in it is still there too, held in the walls of a planet that does not forget easily, waiting with the particular patience of something that has no awareness of waiting, and therefore no impatience with how long it takes. Exal Kressh understood something in that room that the Emperor did not want her to understand. She carried it out of the citadel. She carried it across Republic space. She carried it all the way to Leno station. And even though Teneb Kel stopped her before she finished saying it out loud, the understanding itself, the specific shape of what she knew and what she had tried to do with it, did not entirely disappear when she did. It found other ways to move through the galaxy. It always does. The Dark Council did not panic. This is the first thing worth understanding about their response to Exal Kresh's defection. These were 12 of the most powerful Sith Lords in the galaxy beings who had spent decades accumulating power in an environment where showing weakness was functionally the same as dying. They did not panic over defectors. They did not panic over much of anything, because panic is a form of weakness, and weakness in the Sith hierarchy is an invitation. But they moved fast. Faster than the standard protocol for defector interdiction required. Faster than the situation seemed to demand on the surface. Given that one apprentice, however well-conditioned, running toward the Republic, should not have required the full attention of the 12 most powerful Sith in the Empire within hours of her disappearance being confirmed. They convened. They deliberated. They assigned the mission to Teneb Kel within a time frame that, when you look at it against the standard bureaucratic pace of imperial military operations, is essentially immediate. And in those deliberations partially recovered, fragmentary, missing significant sections that were either never recorded or removed afterward, there is a phrase that does not belong. They called her the most comprehensively prepared of the Emperor's children. Sit with that for a moment. The Dark Council is convening to authorize the hunting and elimination of a traitor. The official position, the position that will appear in every document connected to this matter that circulates below the highest classification levels, is that Exal Kressh broke under the weight of the Emperor's gift. That she was weak. That her defection was a failure of character. A demonstration of the limits of her bloodline. A cautionary example of what happens when the honor of proximity to the Emperor is bestowed on someone insufficiently worthy of it. That is the story the Empire needs this to be. And then the Dark Council, in the same deliberations that authorize her elimination, describes her as the most comprehensively prepared of the Emperor's children. These two things cannot both be true. You cannot be the most comprehensively prepared vessel the Emperor has ever produced, and simultaneously be someone who broke from weakness. Weakness and comprehensive preparation are opposites. The most thoroughly conditioned apprentice in a generation does not run because the conditioning was too much for her. The most thoroughly conditioned apprentice in a generation runs because the conditioning worked, because it gave her access to things she was not supposed to have access to, and what she found there was something she could not unknow. The Dark Council understood this. They understood it in the deliberations. They recorded it, briefly, in language that acknowledged her capability before the document was sealed and the official story took over. And then they sent a barely trained young Sith after her and told him to stop her before she talked. The choice of Teneb Kel is worth examining on its own terms, separate from the question of Exal Kressh herself. By any conventional measure, he was the wrong choice for this mission. He was young. His training was incomplete in ways that his later career would compensate for, but that were genuine limitations at the time. He had a slave companion and a ship and a force connection to the target that was theoretical in its reliability. Against the most comprehensively prepared of the Emperor's children, running with full knowledge of Imperial Hunter methodology across Republic space, where the Empire's reach was thin, Teneb Kel was not the obvious answer. But he was the necessary answer. Because the mission had a requirement that skill level could not address. The mission required someone who could find her, not defeat her, find her. Track her across Republic space through a force connection that no conventional hunter possessed. The Emperor's children conditioning created a bond between those who had undergone it, a thin, unreliable signal, but a signal. Teneb Kel could feel her in the force in a way that no one else the Dark Council could have sent was capable of. This tells you what the Dark Council was actually afraid of. They were not afraid that Exal Kressh would fight her way to safety. They were afraid she would talk before anyone reached her. The urgency of the mission, the speed of the convening, the unconventional choice of hunter, the emphasis in Teneb Kel's instructions on timeline, above all other considerations, was entirely about preventing the delivery. Stop the knowledge from reaching the Jedi. Everything else was secondary. Which means the Dark Council knew exactly what she was carrying. And they knew that if it reached the right people, the consequences would be significant enough to justify sending the wrong person after her, if the wrong person was the only one who could get there in time. Now, here is where Darth Thanitin's later career becomes the most useful document we have. Not because he ever said anything directly about Exal Kressh. He did not. Her name does not appear in any of his recorded statements, his philosophical writings, his political communications, or the various testimonies from his contemporaries that survived the decades following his rise to the Dark Council. She is absent from his record, in the same way she is absent from the Empire's record, completely, deliberately, with the specific completeness that comes from active removal rather than simple omission. But absence has a shape, and the shape of what Darth Thanitin avoided throughout his career points directly at what Teneb Kel heard in Corridor 3 on Leno Station. Thanitin was, by every account of everyone who worked alongside him or beneath him or against him, a man of genuine intellectual capability. He was a master of Sith sorcery and ancient Sith philosophy. He had read more of the old texts than almost anyone in the Empire. He had the kind of mind that found the uncomfortable question in any situation and pressed on it until the discomfort gave way to understanding. Except on one subject, on the subject of the Emperor's true nature, on the question of what the Emperor was actually building toward. what the conditioning of his children was actually for, what the Sith Empire's ultimate purpose actually was. Beneath the layers of conquest and expansion and political machinery, Darth Thanitin was not curious. He was not pressing. He was not asking the uncomfortable question. He was defending the official position with an intensity that had nothing to do with intellectual conviction and everything to do with personal necessity. Sith Lords who genuinely believe in something do not defend it the way Darth Thanitin defended imperial orthodoxy. Genuine believers engage with challenges. They examine the opposing argument, find its weaknesses, dismantle it methodically. They are confident in their position because their position has been tested and held. That confidence produces a specific kind of calm, the calm of someone who has looked at the question from every angle and found their answer sufficient. Thanitin was not calm about this. When subordinates raised questions about the Emperor's methods, he shut the conversation down. When Sith scholars, whose work touched on the nature of the Emperor's conditioning program, came to his attention, those scholars found their research suddenly deprioritized, their access to certain archives restricted, their careers developing in directions that took them away from the subject. When philosophical discussions in the higher levels of the hierarchy began moving toward territory that Thanitin found dangerous, he redirected them with a specific urgency of someone managing a threat rather than engaging an idea. This is not the behavior of a true believer. This is the behavior of someone who knows the answer to the question and has decided that the question must not be examined because examining it leads to a place he has already been and has spent 40 years walking away from. Tanib Kel stood in Corridor 3 on Leno Station and heard what Exal Kressh said while she was fighting him. We do not know the specific words. We will never know the specific words they died in that corridor with her, and the man who heard them chose to seal them inside a 4-sentence report and a lifetime of deliberate not knowing. But the shape of Darth Thanitin's entire career is the negative impression of those words. Everything he avoided, everything he defended against examination, every subject he shut down before it could develop into genuine inquiry, all of it maps onto the specific knowledge that Exal Kressh had been carrying across Republic space and trying to deliver before he stopped her. He heard it. He understood enough of it to know that it was true. And then he decided, in Corridor 3, with her still in front of him, that he was not going to carry it. This is the particular cruelty of what happened between them. They were not strangers. They had both undergone the same conditioning. They had both felt the Emperor's presence settle into them through the same ritual process. They had both lived inside that specific intimacy of having another consciousness threaded through their own. Whatever Exal Kressh felt in those years of service, the confusion of thoughts that were hers and thoughts that were his becoming genuinely indistinguishable, the gradual understanding of what she was being shaped into. Tanib Kel had felt a version of the same thing. He knew the territory she was describing. That is the most uncomfortable part of the whole account. He was not dismissing the words of a stranger. He was dismissing the words of someone who had been through the same experience and had come out the other side understanding it more completely than he had allowed himself to. She was not telling him something alien. She was telling him something he had access to, something the conditioning had given him the same potential to understand that it had given her. He chose not to understand it. He chose, in that corridor, to close the door on the knowledge rather than carry it forward. And then he built his entire subsequent career around keeping that door closed around, making sure that no one in his proximity would ever push it open far enough that he would have to look at what was behind it again. The woman who ran from knowledge shaped the man who refused it. She was trying to warn the galaxy. He spent 40 years making sure the warning did not spread. And the bitterest irony of Darth Thanitin's life, the thing he could not have anticipated when he pocketed that holocron and filed those 4 sentences, is that the refusal did not protect him. The knowledge he refused to carry did not go away. It moved through the galaxy in other ways, through other people, through the chain of consequences that Exal Kressh had started before he found her. And eventually, it came back around to him, in the form of the specific blindness he had cultivated so carefully for so long, and it contributed to the circumstances of his own destruction. He was shaped by what he refused to understand, and what he refused to understand was the thing she died trying to deliver. The Dark Council's deliberation records end where they end, sealed, fragmentary, the most critical sections inaccessible. What survives is enough, the phrase that does not belong, the urgency that exceeds what the official story requires. The specific choice of hunter that only makes sense if the priority was timeline rather than capability. Her enemies understood her better than the official record acknowledges. They understood that she was not running from weakness. They understood that the most comprehensively prepared of the Emperor's children had run because the preparation had worked too well, because it had given her access to the truth of what she was being prepared for. And the truth was something she could not serve. They needed her stopped before she said it out loud. They sent Teneb Kel because he was the only one who could find her in time. He found her. He stopped her. And then he spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of what he had heard her say, not forward, not outward, not toward anyone who could use it, but inward, sealed behind 40 years of deliberate orthodoxy and furious intellectual suppression, held in the specific dark that a person makes inside themselves when they know something they have decided never to know. She ran from knowledge. He ran from her knowledge. In the end, both of them were running from the same thing. Only one of them was running in the right direction. The mission report reached the Dark Council 3 weeks after Teneb Kel left Leno Station. 4 sentences: mission complete. Target eliminated. No complications noted. The Dark Council reviewed it, filed it under the relevant classification header, and added 2 more layers of authorization requirement to the access protocols. The header itself was reclassified within the month. By the time the bureaucratic processing was complete, the record of what had happened on Leno Station existed in a category so restricted that the number of people who could legally access it had been reduced to single digits. They considered it handled. They were not entirely wrong. The primary threat had been neutralized. The knowledge Exal Kressh had been carrying had not reached the Jedi in any organized or direct form. No Jedi Master had sat down with her and heard a complete account of the Emperor's conditioning program and the true purpose of his children. No Republic intelligence official had received a proper briefing. The delivery had been interrupted before it was complete. But here is the thing about interrupted deliveries. Incomplete is not the same as nothing. And the Dark Council, in their confidence that the mission report settled the matter, made the same mistake that people make when they confuse the silencing of a source with the silencing of the information. Exal Kressh had been moving through Republic space for weeks. She had been visible. She had been generating a signal. And signals, once generated, do not disappear when the source does. They propagate. There was a man on Leno Station the day it happened. His name does not appear in any document connected to this account, not because he has been deliberately removed, but because he was never important enough to be included in the first place. He was a Republic intelligence operative, junior rank, assigned to monitor traffic patterns through the Leno system for reasons that had nothing to do with Exal Kressh or the Emperor's children or anything connected to the Sith Empire's internal operations. He was watching for smuggling routes, contraband moving between outer rim systems through the junction point that Leno station occupied. He was in the station's cantina when the sounds came from the mid-ring residential block. He described it later in a field report that went to his immediate supervisor and was filed without particular attention because it contained no information relevant to the smuggling investigation he was assigned to as a disturbance. Sounds consistent with a serious altercation. Duration: approximately 4 minutes. He had moved toward the residential block out of professional habit and arrived at the junction corridor in time to see a young human male in dark clothing moving away from Corridor 3 at a pace that was not running but was not casual either. He noted the clothing. He noted the direction of travel. He noted that when he reached the corridor itself, there was a smell he associated with ozone and scorched material. He noted the maintenance request that appeared on the station's administrative board the following morning for cleaning services in that section. He put all of this in his field report under the heading, "Unrelated Incident, No Action Required." His supervisor read it, agreed with the assessment, and filed it. It sat in a Republic intelligence archive on Coruscant for 8 months. Then a Jedi scout picked up something. This requires some explanation of what Jedi scouts were doing in the Leno region during this period, which requires understanding the broader context of Republic-Imperial relations in the years immediately following the Treaty of Coruscant. The treaty had ended the open conflict. It had not ended the intelligence operations. Both sides were actively monitoring each other's movements through every channel available, and the Jedi, despite the Republic's official position that the Order operated independently of political intelligence gathering, were among the most effective monitors the Republic had. Force-sensitive individuals moving through a region leave traces that other force-sensitive individuals can detect, not perfectly, not reliably enough to be used as primary intelligence, but as a secondary signal, as a way of confirming or complicating information gathered through other means. Jedi scouts in frontier regions provided information that Republic intelligence found consistently useful. The scout operating in the Leno region at the time of Exal Kressh's death was there because there had been elevated force activity in the area for several months. Nothing specific. Nothing that pointed to a particular threat, just a general increase in the kind of disturbance that force-sensitive movement creates in the fabric of things, concentrated in a region that should not have been generating that level of signal. He filed a report 3 weeks after the incident on Leno Station. He noted that the elevated activity had resolved, suddenly dropped to baseline levels within a 24-hour window he could identify with reasonable precision. He noted that this kind of sudden resolution was consistent with either the departure of a significant force-sensitive presence from the region or the death of one. He noted that the timing corresponded with an unrelated report from Republic intelligence about a disturbance on Leno Station, and suggested that someone with relevant authority might want to look at whether the two pieces of information were connected. His report went to a Jedi archivist on Coruscant. The archivist read it, cross-referenced it with the intelligence operative's field report, which had been flagged in the system as potentially relevant to Jedi operations after the Scout's inquiry. Noted in the archive log, possible force-sensitive incident, Leno system, nature unclear, possible Imperial involvement, and then filed it. Because there was no action to take. There was nothing specific enough to act on. There was a disturbance that had resolved, a presence that had either left or died, and a young man in dark clothing walking away from a corridor at a brisk pace. This was not enough to open an investigation. This was not enough to escalate to the council. This was enough to exist in an archive. And that was all Exal Kressh needed. Information that exists in an archive does not stay isolated forever. This is the thing about records, even sealed records, even fragmentary records, even records that no one is actively looking at. They sit in systems that are connected to other systems. They get referenced by later reports that are looking for background context. They get pulled into searches conducted for entirely different purposes. They cross the desks of analysts who are pattern matching across large datasets and notice correlations that no individual report makes visible. The archivist's notation sat for 4 months. Then, a different analyst working on a broader assessment of Imperial activity in Outer Rim adjacent systems, looking for patterns in force-sensitive movement that might indicate Sith military preparation, pulled it into a dataset of similar reports from the same period. The notation about possible Imperial involvement, the timing, the sudden resolution of elevated force activity. He did not know about Exal Kressh. He did not know about the Emperor's children. He did not know what the elevated force activity had been, or who had generated it, or why it had resolved the way it did. What he knew was that the pattern in the data suggested something had happened in the Leno region, something force-related, something with an Imperial signature, something that had ended abruptly. He included it in his assessment under a section heading that would have meant nothing to him and meant everything to the people with enough context to understand it. The heading read, Increased Emperor's Children Activity, Outer Rim Adjacent Systems. He used the phrase because it appeared in the intelligence community's existing taxonomy of force-sensitive Imperial operations. He did not know what it meant precisely. He used it because it fit the pattern. His assessment went to a Republic senator who sat on the Intelligence Oversight Committee. The senator's name is not important for this account. What is important is that he received the assessment, read through it with the attention that Intelligence Oversight Committee members bring to regional threat analyses, which is to say, careful but not expert, and flagged one phrase for follow-up. The phrase was not Emperor's children activity. He had seen that phrase before, and it meant nothing specific to him either. The phrase he flagged was Emperor's personal conditioning program. It appeared once in the assessment, in a footnote explaining the taxonomy the analyst had used. A brief definition. 4 sentences explaining that Emperor's children was the intelligence community's shorthand for a category of Imperial force-sensitive operations that appeared to involve some form of direct conditioning by the Emperor himself, distinct from standard Sith apprenticeship structures. The senator had not seen that phrase before. He sent a query to Republic Intelligence asking for the full briefing material on the Emperor's personal conditioning program. The query went to a senior intelligence officer who did not have a full briefing to send because there was no full briefing. There were fragments. There were the analyst's taxonomy notes. There was the archivist's notation about the Leno incident. There were 2 other reports from different regions over the preceding 5 years that the taxonomy had been applied to, neither of which had been examined carefully at the time. The senior intelligence officer pulled all of it together, added context notes, and sent it to the senator as a preliminary briefing document under the title, Emperor's Children Program Summary of Available Intelligence. It was the first document of its kind. It existed because an operative had been in a cantina on Leno Station at the right moment. Because a Jedi scout had been monitoring the wrong region for the right reason. Because an archivist had made a notation that seemed too vague to act on. Because an analyst had been pattern matching across datasets and noticed something that no individual report had made visible. None of these people knew each other. None of them knew about Exal Kressh. None of them understood that the chain they were part of had started in Corridor 3 of the mid-ring residential block on a forgotten station above a gas giant. The listener knows. The listener is the only one in this account who can see the whole chain at once. The preliminary briefing document reached the Jedi Council through standard intelligence sharing protocols. This took another 3 months. The Republic's relationship with the Jedi Order in the post-treaty period was collaborative in theory and complicated in practice. Intelligence was shared, but selectively. The Council received what Republic officials decided was relevant to Jedi operations, filtered through the same political considerations that filtered everything in the early Cold War period. The briefing was relevant, it was shared. A council member read it. We do not know which one. The meeting records from this period are incomplete, another consequence of the Jedi's relocation to Thanitin and the disruption of their archival systems during and after the war. What we have is a reference, in a later document, to a council discussion about Imperial conditioning operations, dated to the right period, that includes a notation, briefing received, assessment, ongoing, further intelligence required before action is warranted. Assessment, ongoing. This is the language institutions use when they have received something that concerns them and they are not yet sure what to do with it. The council member who read the briefing set it down when they were finished. The narrator of this account cannot tell you with certainty what their expression was. But there is a specific expression that people wear when they read something that confirms a fear they had been hoping to dismiss when the information in front of them closes a door they had been keeping slightly open. The door marked, perhaps this is not as serious as it seems. When that door closes, the expression is not alarm exactly. It is something quieter than alarm, something that looks, from the outside, like stillness, but is, on the inside, the recognition that a threat is more real than you had allowed yourself to believe. The council member set the briefing down, filed it for follow-up, went on to the next item. Exal Kressh did not know any of this was happening. She had been dead for over a year by the time the briefing reached the Jedi Council. She had died in Corridor 3 believing, in all likelihood, that she had failed completely. That the knowledge she had carried across Republic space had died with her. That Teneb Kel had arrived in time to prevent anything from getting through. She was wrong. Not entirely. She had not succeeded in what she was trying to do. The Jedi Council did not receive a complete account of the Emperor's true intentions. The Emperor's children conditioning program was not fully understood by anyone in Republic space as a result of what she started. The change she set in motion did not deliver what she was trying to deliver, but it delivered something. A phrase in an intelligence taxonomy, a preliminary briefing document, a Jedi Council discussion with a notation that said assessment, ongoing. These are not nothing. These are the first recorded instances of the Republic's awareness that the Emperor was doing something to specific Force-sensitive individuals, something personal, something direct, something that operated outside the normal structures of Sith apprenticeship. That awareness would grow, slowly, through other sources, through other incidents, through the gradual accumulation of evidence that always precedes genuine understanding of a complex threat. The chain Exal Kressh started was one thread among many that would eventually be woven into something large enough to see clearly. But it was a thread. She put it there. In the dark, without knowing it, through the noise of a chase across Republic space and a fight in a corridor on a forgotten station, and the specific pattern of disturbance that a force-sensitive death leaves in the places around it, she put a thread into the galaxy's awareness that would pull, very slowly, in the direction of the truth. She died, thinking she had failed completely. The galaxy moved around the thread she left behind, not knowing it was there, not knowing where it had come from, not knowing that the person who put it there had been trying to deliver something far more complete and had almost made it. Almost. The Jedi Council member who read the briefing and set it down with that particular expression did not connect it to anyone specific. Did not know about the incident on Leno Station. Did not know about the woman who had run across Republic space carrying a holocron in her coat and a warning in her mind that she had not been able to finish saying. Did not know that the document they were reading existed because of decisions made by people who had never met each other. In a chain that started with one woman walking out of the Emperor's citadel on Dromund Kaas and heading toward the only place she thought might listen. The document existed. The awareness existed. The thread was in the galaxy now, and in the dark of an archive shelf in Coruscant. The preliminary briefing document sat alongside the archivist's notation and the analyst's assessment and the operative's field report, all of them together in a folder that would be pulled out and added to and refined and eventually become something significant years from now, through the work of people who would never know whose death had made the folder possible. Exal Kressh started something she never knew she started. She finished nothing she intended to finish. And the gap between those two facts is where the galaxy eventually found its way to understanding what she had been trying to say. Objects do not know what they are carrying. This is obvious when you say it out loud. A hexagonal crystal device has no awareness of the data stored inside it, no understanding of why that data matters, no sense of the weight that the person who recorded it was carrying when they made it. Objects are inert. They hold what they hold, and they go where they go, and the significance of all of it is entirely in the people who interact with them. But there is something that happens to objects that have passed through significant moments. Not mystical, or not only mystical, though force-sensitive individuals who have handled the object in question have noted something about it that they found difficult to describe in purely practical terms. Something more like the way a room holds the feeling of what happened in it. The way a tool used for something important feels different from the same tool never used at all. The holocron that Exal Kressh stole from Dromund Kaas and carried across Republic space and died still carrying on Leno Station has been in 6 pairs of hands since the night Teneb Kel put it in his coat. None of those 6 people fully understood what they were holding. The listener does. And that understanding sitting with this object through every hand it passed through, knowing what it contains while the people carrying it do not, is one of the most uncomfortable positions this account puts you in. Teneb Kel carried it for 3 years. 3 years from the night he pocketed it in Corridor 3, until the night it left his possession, a period during which it sat, as far as we can determine from the complete absence of any reference to it in his records, entirely unexamined. He did not activate it. He did not attempt to access the data inside. He did not show it to anyone or mention it in any communication or reference it in any of the philosophical writings he began producing during this period as his career in the Sith hierarchy accelerated. He had it. He did not look at it. The narrator of this account has spent considerable time with this fact and cannot arrive at a single clean explanation for it. The obvious explanation that he knew what it contained and did not want to look fits the broader pattern of his career. the deliberate not knowing that shaped everything Darth Thanitin became. But it is not the only possible explanation. It is possible that he genuinely forgot about it for periods, that it sat in whatever drawer or storage space he kept it in and simply did not occupy his attention. People who carry objects they are not ready to examine often manage this through the simple mechanism of not thinking about the object. Out of sight, in a very literal way, not processed, not integrated. Just present and unexamined in the background of a life that had other things to occupy it. It is also possible, and this is the explanation, that fits the smallest detail of what we know about how it eventually left his possession, that he kept it deliberately, not to examine it, not to use it, but because getting rid of it would have required him to decide what to do with it, and deciding what to do with it would have required him to acknowledge that he had it. And acknowledging that he had it would have required him to explain why he had not reported it. He kept it because keeping it was the easiest of the available options. For 3 years. Then the Great War started. The period of tension and preparation that had been building throughout the preceding decades finally erupted into open conflict. The Sith Empire moving against the Republic in a campaign that would eventually result in the sacking of Coruscant, the burning of the Jedi Temple, and the treaty that everyone who signed it understood to be a pause rather than an ending. Teneb Kel now moving through the Sith hierarchy with increasing speed. His success on the Leno station mission, having established him as someone the Dark Council was willing to invest in, was involved in operations during this period that are, like most things connected to him, partially documented and significantly sealed. What we know is that the holocron left his possession during this period. The exact mechanism of transfer is the part of this story that the narrator cannot reconstruct with any confidence. The possibilities are several and genuinely distinct from each other in what they suggest about Teneb Kel's state of mind at the time. It may have been deliberate. He may have placed it somewhere, passed it to someone, arranged for it to move out of his possession in a way that was intentional, but left no record, because leaving a record would have required explaining why he had it in the first place. It may have been accidental, the chaos of wartime operations, movements between locations, the general turbulence of a period in which the established order of things was being significantly rearranged. Objects get lost in wars. Objects get separated from their owners by logistics and urgency, and the simple fact that keeping track of everything when everything is moving is genuinely difficult. Or, and this is the explanation, the narrator finds most consistent with everything else we know about Darth Thanitin. It may have been a moment of something that was not quite guilt, but was adjacent to it. A point at which the weight of carrying the object had accumulated beyond what passive not examining could manage, and the easiest resolution was simply to put it somewhere. It was no longer his problem. Not destroyed. He did not destroy it. That is the detail that matters most. He had 3 years, and then a period of wartime operations, during which destroying the holocron would have been simple, untraceable, and final. He did not do it. Whatever his reasons for keeping it were, they were strong enough to prevent destruction, even when destruction was the obvious way to make the problem disappear permanently. He let it go instead. And it went. The next pair of hands belonged to a woman named Sela Dorn. She was a Republic intelligence archaeologist, a specialist in the identification and assessment of recovered Sith artifacts, working in the field during the Cold War period that followed the treaty. Her job was to move through regions where the war had disturbed things, where Sith operations had left traces. where the general turbulence of the conflict had caused objects to surface that would otherwise have remained hidden, and to catalog what she found, identify it, assess its significance, move it to appropriate Republic custody. She was not looking for this particular holocron. She found it during an operation near the Outer Rim. The precise location is not in her surviving field notes, which begin after she has already acquired the object, and focus on her assessment of it rather than on the circumstances of acquisition. This gap is frustrating from a historical perspective. We do not know exactly where the transition happened, which means we cannot reconstruct the chain between Teneb Kel's possession and Sela Dawn's with the precision this account would prefer. What we have is her field notes from the point of acquisition forward. And her field notes are, in their own way, the most honest document in this entire account. She described the holocron on first examination with the careful precision of someone trained to observe without assuming. Small, hexagonal, dark red crystal matrix, consistent with Sith manufacture from the pre-war period. Gatekeeper mechanism present, but corrupted. No active voice response, no projectable image. The standard interface by which a holocron communicates with those who seek to access it, essentially non-functional. Data storage apparently intact. Content unknown due to gatekeeper corruption, preventing standard access protocols. She noted the age, consistent with manufacture, approximately 5 to 10 years prior to her assessment, which placed its creation in the period immediately preceding the Great War. She noted the quality of the construction above standard, suggesting a manufacturer with access to higher-grade materials than common Sith Academy production. She noted that the crystal matrix showed no signs of the kind of deterioration that suggested improper storage, which meant whoever had been carrying it had been keeping it in conditions that preserved it, even if they had not been using it. Someone had been taking care of it without looking at it. She did not note this conclusion explicitly. She noted the condition and moved on. But it is visible in the data she recorded, if you are looking for it. Then, there is an entry that she crossed out. The crossing out is thorough. She went over it multiple times, pressing hard enough that the original text is illegible through the lines. Whatever she wrote and then decided not to include in the professional record, she took the removal seriously. But the fact of the crossing out is itself visible, and the placement of it between her notes on the physical condition of the device and her cataloging notation suggests it was something she felt while handling it. Something she observed and then decided was too subjective, too imprecise, too much like the kind of thing that did not belong in an intelligence field report. The narrator cannot read what she crossed out. But there is a phrase in a letter she wrote to a colleague several months later, a personal letter, not a professional document, discussing the strange textures of fieldwork and the objects that stayed with her after cataloging that may be relevant. She described one artifact from that operation as feeling like it was waiting for something. She did not name the artifact. She did not describe it in enough detail to confirm identification. She crossed out the line in her field notes. She did not cross it out in the letter. She catalogued it as SR-774. Sith holocron, origin unknown, gatekeeper status non-functional, data content inaccessible through standard protocols, estimated manufacture date pre-war period, physical condition excellent. Recommended for transfer to Jedi Temple Archive on Thanitin for assessment by force-sensitive specialists capable of attempting non-standard data access. She put it in her field satchel. It rode there for 2 weeks while she completed the rest of her operational assignment and arranged transport back to Republic space. 2 weeks in a satchel, in the dark, surrounded by the sounds of whatever ship she was working from the hum of engines, the particular ambient noise of a vessel in hyperspace, the sounds of people moving through corridors and eating meals and doing the ordinary work of being alive in space. The holocron had been in a coat pocket on Dromund Kaas. It had been through a war. It had been in whatever temporary storage Teneb Kel used during his operational periods. And now, it was in a satchel, catalogued as SR 774, origin, unknown, riding through hyperspace toward Tython, in the bag of a woman who had crossed out one line of her field notes and written something in a letter that she did not send to her supervisors. It was still carrying what Exal Kressh had put inside it. The conditioning protocols, the partial records, the evidence of what the Emperor was doing to his chosen vessels, and what he intended to do with them when the preparation was complete. Sitting in the dark, patient in the way objects are patient. Going, finally, in the direction Exal Kressh had been trying to send it. Sela Dawn delivered it to the Jedi Temple archive on Tython personally. This was not standard procedure for objects catalogued at her level of assessment. SR-class artifacts typically moved through standard logistics channels rather than personal courier. She made an exception for SR 774. Her transfer documentation notes only that she considered personal delivery appropriate given the artifact's potential significance. The Jedi archivist who received it was a methodical man whose name appears in several decades of archive records as a careful and thorough cataloger of recovered Force-sensitive objects. He knew his work. He had handled hundreds of Sith artifacts over his career, and he understood the range of what they could contain and what they could feel like, and when to take extra care with something before shelving it. He held SR 774 for a moment before he filed it. His intake notation is brief, as intake notations tend to be. Object received. Condition confirmed as per transfer documentation. Gatekeeper non-functional. Data content requires specialist assessment. And then one final line, added in handwriting slightly less neat than the rest of the notation, as though it was added quickly, almost as an afterthought. Requires further examination. He never returned to it. The archive shelf closed over it. The sealed room it eventually came to rest in was locked 11 years ago and has not been opened since. SR 774 is still there, in the dark, in the silence of a room that no one has entered in 11 years, on a shelf that holds other objects with their own histories and their own weights, in an archive that continues to exist because archives continue to exist even when no one is actively tending them. It is carrying what Exal Kressh carried across Republic space, the conditioning protocols, the partial records of what the Emperor was preparing his children for, the evidence that she stole from Dromund Kaas because she believed it would help someone understand what was coming. 6 pairs of hands. None of them looked inside. The gatekeeper is corrupted. Standard access protocols do not work. What the device contains is not accessible through the methods that the people who held it knew how to use. What it would take to access the data, a Force-sensitive individual with the specific knowledge to attempt non-standard retrieval on a corrupted pre-war Sith device, has not yet been applied to it. Not yet. The object sits in the dark and waits the way objects wait, without awareness, without impatience, without any sense of the time that is passing around it. It has been waiting for 11 years in that room. It waited 3 years in Teneb Kel's possession before that. It waited 2 weeks in Sela Dawn's satchel. It has been waiting in one form or another, since the night Exal Kressh put it in her coat on Dromund Kaas and walked out of the Emperor's citadel into the dark. It is still waiting for the right person to open it. Darth Thanitin did not become powerful by accident. This is worth establishing before anything else, because the account of his career that this chapter is building toward could easily be read as the story of a man diminished by what he refused to know, and that reading, while not wrong, is incomplete. Thanitin was genuinely formidable. His rise through the Sith hierarchy was not the rise of someone coasting on political connections or fortunate timing. He worked, he studied, he accumulated knowledge and capability with the focused intensity of someone who had decided very early exactly what he was going to become and was unwilling to let anything interrupt the process. He was a master of Sith sorcery by his mid-career, a discipline that requires not just force sensitivity, but years of dedicated study in texts that most Sith lords find too esoteric to bother with. He had read the old archives. He understood the philosophical foundations of Sith power in ways that his contemporaries often did not bother to develop. He could hold his own against opponents significantly more powerful than himself through a combination of technique and accumulated knowledge that compensated for whatever raw advantages he lacked. On the surface, Darth Thanitin's career is the account of exactly what the Sith Empire was designed to produce. The problem is what sits underneath the surface. His commitment to Sith orthodoxy was the defining feature of his political identity from the earliest period of his career as Darth Thanitin forward. By orthodoxy, we mean something specific. The Sith hierarchy contains within it a range of philosophical positions, different interpretations of the rule of two, different understandings of what the dark side is and what it is for, different views on the relationship between individual Sith lords and the Emperor's authority. Some of these positions are more traditional, some are more experimental. The tension between them is, in a functioning Sith hierarchy, productive. It generates conflict, and conflict generates strength, and strength is the point. Thanitin was not interested in this tension. He was not interested in the experimental positions. He was not interested in engaging with alternative interpretations of Sith philosophy and finding their weaknesses through examination. He was interested in the traditional positions, the established hierarchy, the Emperor's absolute authority, the structure that the Sith Empire had built around itself over the centuries of its preparation in Dromund Kaas, and he defended those positions with an energy that went significantly beyond what professional conservatism required. He fought against Sith lords, who he perceived as heterodox with a personal investment that his contemporaries found disproportionate. He used his political influence to restrict access to certain research. He attached himself to the established order with the specific grip of someone who needs the established order to remain exactly as it is, because the alternative, a Sith hierarchy that examines its own foundations, that asks hard questions about the Emperor's true nature, that looks carefully at what the conditioning program was actually for, is something he cannot afford to allow. This is not the orthodoxy of conviction. This is the orthodoxy of containment. To understand the difference, you have to look at how Thanitin responded to challenges. A Sith Lord who defends a position from genuine conviction does so with a particular quality of engagement. They listen to the challenge, they examine it, they find the weakness in it, and they press on that weakness until the challenge collapses. This process is confident. It has the confidence of someone who has tested their position against opposition before and found it holding. The defense is calm because the defender trusts what they are defending. Thanitin was not calm. When a young Sith scholar, under his oversight, produced a research paper examining the historical relationship between the Emperor's personal conditioning operations and the broader strategic objectives of the Empire. Thanitin did not engage with the paper. He did not call the scholar in and identify the weaknesses in the argument. He had the paper classified and the scholar reassigned to a posting in the Outer Rim that effectively ended the research program. When a philosophical discussion among senior Sith Lords at a Dark Council-adjacent gathering began moving toward the question of what the Emperor's Children program was ultimately designed to produce, Thanitin redirected the conversation with a speed and an abruptness that several attendees noted as out of character even for him. One of them wrote afterward in a private communication that Thanitin had responded as though the question itself was dangerous rather than simply mistaken. He was right about that. The question was dangerous, for him specifically, because he knew where the question led, and he had decided that he was not going to follow it. The narrator of this account wants to be honest about what we can establish with certainty and what we cannot. We cannot establish with certainty that Darth Thanitin's orthodoxy was specifically and consciously constructed to avoid the knowledge that Exal Kressh had tried to give him on Leno Station. It is possible, and the narrator acknowledges this possibility, that the connection is not as direct as this account suggests. That Thanitin's conservatism developed from other sources, other experiences, other aspects of his formation as a Sith Lord, and that Leno Station was simply one moment among many rather than the defining pivot the narrator is placing it as. What we can establish is this: the specific shape of what Thanitin avoided throughout his career, the specific questions he shut down, the specific research he suppressed, the specific philosophical territory he refused to enter maps with uncomfortable precision onto the knowledge that Exal Kressh was carrying when she died. The Emperor's conditioning program, the true purpose of the Emperor's children. The nature of what the Emperor was actually building toward beneath the surface of his imperial project. These are the exact things Thanitin avoided, not adjacent to them, not in the general neighborhood of them, exactly them, with a precision that is either the most remarkable coincidence in the history of the Sith hierarchy or the most significant consequence of a 4-sentence mission report filed by a young man who had heard something in a corridor that he decided never to examine. The narrator finds coincidence insufficient as an explanation. There is one more layer to Thanitin's career that deserves attention before we arrive at its end. His treatment of those he considered his inferiors, particularly those who showed signs of unusual power or unconventional capability, was notable even by Sith standards. The Sith hierarchy is not gentle with weakness, and a Sith Lord who destroys subordinates who challenge him is not doing anything unusual. But Thanitin's particular targets, across his decades of operation, were not random. He went after the ones who asked questions. Not all questions. He was not suppressing general intellectual activity in his sphere of influence. He was targeting individuals who demonstrated the specific combination of force power and philosophical independence that might eventually lead them toward the territory he was managing. Individuals who showed signs of thinking about the Emperor's nature in ways that went beyond the orthodox. Individuals whose research interests were drifting in directions he found threatening. He identified them early, and he removed them from the equation before they got far enough to find anything. This is the career of a man who knows where the dangerous questions lead and is spending significant resources making sure no one else follows the path. And then he encountered someone he could not remove from the equation. The young Sith, who eventually brought Darth Thanitin's career to its end, is part of a different story, a story about power and hierarchy and the specific cruelty of a system that produces its own destroyers. The details of that conflict are not the focus of this account. What is relevant is a specific quality of the confrontation that fits the pattern we have been tracing. Thanitin lost because he was fighting someone who carried none of his refusals. This is not a simple statement about power levels, though the power differential was real. It is a statement about the specific liability that Thanitin's career of deliberate not knowing had created. He had built himself into a formidable Sith Lord, but he had built himself in a specific shape, a shape with a gap in it, a hollow at the center where certain kinds of understanding should have been carved out and kept empty for 40 years through enormous ongoing effort. The person who defeated him had no such gap, and the gap was the weakness. Not because the knowledge Exal Kressh had been carrying would have made him undefeatable. Not because understanding the Emperor's true nature would have given Thanitin some direct tactical advantage in the fight that ended his career, but because the same impulse that had led him to seal off the dangerous knowledge, the same decision to not know, to not examine, to protect himself from what examination might reveal, had shaped every subsequent choice he made. The orthodoxy he had built to contain the knowledge had also constrained him, made him rigid in ways that flexibility might have addressed, made him committed to structures and hierarchies and established orders at a moment when the person destroying him was committed only to winning. He had spent 40 years building walls around one room in his mind, and the walls, built that high and that thick, eventually made it difficult to move. The woman who first showed him that room was Exal Kressh. Not deliberately, she was not trying to trap him, or damage him, or plant a flaw that would eventually destroy him. She was trying to warn him. She was trying to make him understand something that she had already understood, in the hope that he would make a different choice than she expected, and carry what she was carrying toward people who could use it. He did not make a different choice, but she shaped him anyway. Everything he became after Leno Station, the orthodoxy, the suppression, the specific shape of his intellectual rigidity, was built around the space that her knowledge had opened in him and that he had immediately moved to close. He was not shaped by what she told him. He was shaped by his refusal of what she told him. The architecture of his entire subsequent career was constructed around that single closed door. She was trying to give him something. He spent 40 years making sure it had nowhere to go. And in making sure it had nowhere to go, he made himself into exactly the kind of Sith Lord who could be defeated by someone who had not made the same choice. Someone who carried no such refusal. Someone who had not built walls anywhere because they had not found anything they needed to wall off. He was shaped by her in the end, not the way she intended, not the way either of them would have chosen, but shaped definitively and permanently by the woman who died in Corridor 3 trying to make him see something he spent the rest of his life refusing to look at. She ran toward the truth. He spent 40 years running from it, and in the end, the running cost him everything she had been trying to help him avoid. The narrator of this account does not find satisfaction in this. It would be easier, tidier, more emotionally complete if Thanitin's fall felt like justice. If the woman who tried to warn him was somehow vindicated by the fate of the man who refused to listen. But that is not how this works. His destruction did not restore what was lost in Corridor 3. It did not deliver the knowledge she was carrying to anyone who could use it. It did not undo the 40 years of suppression, or return the research he classified, or give back the careers he ended. It simply added one more consequence to the chain she started. One more thing that happened because of a fight in a corridor that nobody officially recorded. One more person shaped by the absence of what she had been trying to say. The gap she left in the galaxy when she died in that corridor has been generating consequences ever since. Teneb Kel's refusal, the document trail she started, the holocron in the archive. And now this, a powerful Sith Lord, built around a hollow, defeated in ways that the hollow made possible, falling because of a decision he made 40 years ago in a room he never discussed and never returned to. The knowledge she was carrying did not save him, but the shape of his refusal to carry it destroyed him. She would not have wanted that. She was trying to warn everyone, including him. Every significant person who dies in difficult circumstances gets replaced, eventually, by a version of themselves that is easier to live with. This is not malice. It is not usually even conscious. It is the way institutions and communities and opposing sides in a conflict process the complicated reality of what a person actually was into something that serves the present moment better than the truth does. The truth is messy. It has edges. It does not fit cleanly into the categories that surviving parties need to use. And so the truth gets smoothed, compressed, reshaped, not into a lie, exactly, but into a version that can be held without cutting anyone. Exal Kressh got 2 of these versions, one from each side, and the gap between those 2 versions and the person who actually existed is the most honest measure of how much it cost the galaxy that she died before she finished saying what she was trying to say. The Empire's version is the simpler of the 2, and the more brutal. In the official Imperial account, the one that circulated in fragmentary form, through the levels of the Sith hierarchy that were permitted to know anything about the incident at all, Exal Kressh was a vessel who broke under the weight of the Emperor's gift. She was not strong enough to bear what she had been given. The conditioning, which was an honor beyond what most Sith would ever receive, had proven too much for her. Her bloodline, diminished by a century of political caution since the fall of Ludo Kressh, had ultimately not produced someone capable of sustaining proximity to the Emperor's power. She broke, she ran, she was eliminated. This is a complete story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has a clear moral. The honor of the Emperor's attention requires extraordinary strength to carry, and not everyone who receives it is equal to what it demands. It positions the Emperor as a force too vast and powerful for ordinary people to contain. It positions Exal Kressh as ordinary, not wicked, not threatening, simply insufficient. It does not require anyone to ask what she knew. It does not require anyone to wonder what she was running toward. It does not require anyone to examine the conditioning program, what it actually did, what it was actually for, what the Emperor was actually building when he chose his children and shaped them into vessels. The story the Empire needed was a story about weakness, because a story about weakness closes questions. A story about knowledge opens them. The Republic's version is less deliberate and in some ways more damaging for exactly that reason. The Empire constructed their version consciously, with the specific awareness that the alternative was dangerous. The Republic's version grew more organically from incomplete information, from the fog of a Cold War intelligence environment, from the reasonable institutional response to a Sith defector moving through Republic space under circumstances that nobody on the Republic side fully understood, to Republic intelligence and to the Jedi who were aware of the incident. Exal Kressh was a threat that had been neutralized before it fully materialized. A pureblood Sith in the Emperor's service, heavily conditioned, moving through Republic space with unknown intentions. A dangerous asset on the wrong side of the boundary, who had been stopped before she could do whatever she had come to do. This is also a complete story. And it is also wrong in the same fundamental way. It requires Exal Kressh to be a threat rather than a source. It requires her presence in Republic space to be an operation rather than a defection. It requires her death to be a security success rather than an intelligence failure of the First Order. Because if she was a defector, if she was running toward the Jedi rather than against them, then the question of what she was carrying becomes urgent. And the question of who stopped her before she could deliver it becomes uncomfortable. And the question of what the galaxy lost when she died in Corridor 3 becomes the kind of question that institutional memory finds very difficult to hold without doing something about. It is much easier to file her as a threat neutralized. Close the record. Move on. Now here is what both versions share, and why that shared quality is the most revealing thing about them. Both versions require Exal Kressh to have been stopped appropriately. The Empire's version requires her to have been stopped because she was a traitor who deserved stopping. The Republic's version requires her to have been stopped because she was a threat that needed stopping. In both cases, the stopping was correct. In both cases, the outcome was the right outcome. In both cases, nobody made a mistake, and nobody failed in their responsibilities, and the result, while perhaps not exactly pleasant, was the appropriate result given the circumstances. Neither version has room for the possibility that stopping her was the worst thing that could have happened. Neither version can accommodate the account that this script has been building of a woman who understood something genuinely critical about the Emperor's intentions and was running toward the only people in the galaxy she believed could use that understanding, and who died before she could deliver it, and whose death was filed as a success by both sides of the conflict she was trying to help resolve. The myth protects both sides from that account. The Empire's myth protects the Emperor from examination. The Republic's myth protects the Jedi from guilt. And the real Exal Kressh, the person who walked out of Dromund Kaas alone with a stolen holocron and 40 years of knowledge and the understanding of what was coming, disappears into the gap between the two stories that needed her to be something other than what she was. There is a Jedi archivist on Thanitin who held the holocron for approximately 4 minutes before he shelved it. We have established this, already his intake notation, his final line about requiring further examination, the fact that he never returned to it. But this chapter requires sitting with that moment more carefully than we have before. He was not a careless man. He was methodical, thorough, experienced, with recovered Sith artifacts in ways that gave him genuine expertise. He had handled objects far more obviously significant than SR-774. He knew what a corrupted gatekeeper meant, and he knew what the recommendation for specialist assessment meant. And he knew, in the way that force-sensitive archivists know things about objects they are handling, that there was something in this particular device that warranted attention. He wrote his note. He shelved it. And then he went on to the next item in the intake queue, and then to the item after that, and then to the end of the workday, and then to the next workday, and then to the weeks and months and years that followed, without the notation being actioned, and without the specialist assessment being arranged, and without SR-774 being retrieved from its shelf and examined by someone with the capacity to actually access what it contained. The narrator of this account wants to be very clear about something. This is not villainous. It is not even negligent in any meaningful professional sense. Archives are full of items requiring further examination. Archivists are full of notations that were accurate assessments of priority made under the time constraints of actual working conditions. The gap between flagging something and following up on it is not a gap created by malice or indifference. It is a gap created by the ordinary arithmetic of more items than ours. More items requiring attention than attention available. He did what he could with what he had. He noted it. He moved on. And somehow, this is the part the narrator finds most difficult to set down cleanly. Somehow, that ordinariness is worse than malice would have been. Malice has a face. Malice has an agent. Malice can be identified and examined and assigned to a specific choice that a specific person made for specific reasons. What happened to SR 774 on the archive shelf of the Jedi Temple on Thanitin was not malice. It was bandwidth. It was the ordinary, understandable, completely reasonable limitation of institutions and individuals operating within the constraints of what is actually possible on any given workday. And it meant that what Exal Kressh died trying to deliver has been sitting in the dark for 11 years. What does it cost when history gets someone wrong? Not in the abstract, not in the philosophical sense of what truth is owed to any individual. In the practical sense, what does it specifically cost? In the account this script has been tracing, that both sides of the galaxy settled on versions of Exal Kressh that required her to have been correctly stopped. The Empire's version cost the most, obviously. It meant that no one within the Sith hierarchy who had the access and the capability to examine the Emperor's conditioning program was incentivized to do so. The story was complete. The question was closed. She was weak, and she failed, and the program continues, and nothing needs to be looked at more carefully. Anyone who was privately uncomfortable with aspects of the Emperor's children operation, and there were such people, there are always such people in any institution built around a secret that significant had no entry point from which to press on the discomfort. The story of weakness foreclosed the avenue of examination. The Republic's version cost differently. It meant that the intelligence chain Exal Kressh had inadvertently started the thread she put in the galaxy's awareness through the noise of her flight, and her death was never connected to her. Never traced back to a source, never understood as the product of a deliberate choice made by someone who understood what she was doing and accepted the cost of doing it. The thread existed. The briefing document existed. The council notation about assessment, ongoing, existed. But they existed as anonymous intelligence fragments of pattern without a face, without a story, without the weight that comes from understanding that someone specific died to put them there. Information without context is harder to act on than information with it. The Republic's myth, threat neutralized, case closed, stripped the context from the information she left behind, and left it floating in the archive without the story that would have given it urgency. She was trying to warn them. They filed her as a threat, and the warning sat in pieces in various archives, unconnected, uncontextualized, gradually accumulating dust while the galaxy moved through its cold and careful peace toward whatever is coming next. The listener has spent 7 chapters with this account. The listener knows things that no single person inside the story knows. The listener knows what she was carrying, and why she was running, and what she was trying to do, and how close she came, and what stopped her, and what her death set in motion that she never knew she had started. The listener has held the shape of the real person across all of that. And now the listener is asked to hold that shape against the two myths. The traitor too weak to serve. The threat appropriately neutralized. Neither of these is the person the listener has been sitting with for 7 chapters. The person the listener has been sitting with walked out of the Emperor's citadel alone, knowing what she was carrying, knowing what was behind her, knowing that the people ahead of her had every reason to kill her before she finished a sentence. She walked out anyway. She crossed Republic space anyway. She kept moving toward the destination anyway, changing routes, staying ahead of the hunter for as long as she could, making the noise of her passage as visible as she could manage, so that even if she did not make it, something of what she was carrying might get through. She was not weak. She was not a threat. She was someone who understood something genuinely terrible and chose to run toward the people who might be able to use that understanding, at a cost she may have already accepted, because the alternative was serving the thing she had understood. Both myths needed her to be something other than this, because this version of her makes both sides responsible for what was lost when she died. And responsibility is the one thing that established myths are almost always designed to avoid. The record was wrong from the beginning. Not wrong in the way that records are wrong when someone lacks information and fills the gap with the best available guess. Wrong in the way that records are wrong when the person creating them has a specific interest in the conclusion the record reaches, when the framing is not a neutral attempt to describe what happened, but a deliberate selection of the aspects of what happened that serve the story the institution needs to tell. The Dark Council's official categorization of Exal Kresh's defection was produced within hours of her death being confirmed. This is itself a remarkable fact. Standard imperial documentation processes for incidents of this sensitivity typically took days. The information had to be gathered, cross-referenced, reviewed at multiple levels of authority before it was committed to an official record. The speed of the Exal Kressh categorization suggests that the conclusion had been decided before the documentation process began. That someone at or near the Dark Council level had determined, before Teneb Kel's mission report even arrived, what the official version of events was going to say. The categorization that emerged described her defection as a failure of conditioning, a vessel who had been prepared beyond her capacity to sustain. The Emperor's power, too vast for her to contain, had destabilized her. She had broken. She had run. The running was the symptom of the break, not a choice. Not a decision, not an act of will. This framing did 3 things simultaneously. It protected the Emperor from any suggestion that his conditioning program had produced an informed objector rather than a failed vessel. It protected the Dark Council from any obligation to examine what she had understood and whether that understanding was accurate. And it produced a mission framing for Teneb Kel that defined his objective as neutralization of an unstable asset rather than interrogation of a potentially critical intelligence source. Neutralize, not interrogate. Stop her, not listen to her. That instruction, embedded in the mission framing that came from the official categorization, is the single most consequential mistake in this entire account. Because Teneb Kel was already the wrong choice for a purely neutralization mission, his value was in the force connection that allowed him to find her. But if the mission framing had been interrogation, his presence would have made sense in a completely different way. He was connected to her through the conditioning. He had shared the same experience she had. He was, of all the people the Dark Council could have sent, the most capable of understanding what she was trying to communicate. The mission framing made him a hunter. A different framing would have made him a listener. And if he had gone to Leno Station as a listener rather than a hunter, the conversation in Corridor 3 might have gone somewhere other than where it went. The Jedi's mistake was different in its mechanism, but identical in its result. To understand it, you need to understand what information the Jedi had about Exal Kressh at the point when she entered Republic space. They had the Empire's characterization. Not directly, the Jedi did not receive official Imperial briefings on internal Sith personnel matters, but the characterization had moved through the intelligence channels that existed between the two sides. In the fragmentary, indirect way, that information always moves through intelligence channels during periods of nominal peace and actual ongoing surveillance. The picture that had assembled itself in Jedi and Republic intelligence awareness about the individual moving through their space was built substantially from the framing the Empire had chosen. An unstable Sith. A conditioned vessel who had broken under the weight of the process, moving erratically through Republic space with unknown but probably dangerous intentions. This is not the profile of a defector. This is the profile of a threat. And when you are operating with the profile of a threat, every decision you make about how to respond is shaped by that profile. You do not approach a threat with the openness that you bring to a potential source of intelligence. You do not position yourself to listen. You position yourself to contain and neutralize, because that is what the profile calls for. The Jedi presence on and around Leno Station, the scout who had been monitoring Force activity in the region, and the possibility of at least one Jedi Knight in the vicinity who may have been responding to the elevated Force signal of the situation was shaped by this profile. They were not there to hear her. They were there because something dangerous was happening, and they needed to understand the threat. There is a notation. The narrator of this account has referenced it briefly in earlier chapters, but this is the moment to examine it directly, because it is the most important document in the entire record, not for what it says, but for what happened to it after it was written. A Jedi Knight, unnamed in any document we have access to, present in the Leno region during the period of the incident, for reasons that are themselves not clearly documented, wrote a private notation in the aftermath of what happened on Leno Station. The notation is brief. It appears in a collection of field notes from the period that were archived without particular attention, mixed in with operational records from other missions and routine reports that were filed and forgotten in the ordinary way of things. It would not be visible at all if a researcher had not been working through the full archive of Cold War-era Jedi field documentation and noticed, in the middle of entirely unremarkable material, a few sentences that did not fit the surrounding content. The notation says, in its entirety, something close to this, and the narrator emphasizes that we are working from a transcription of a transcription, and the precise original wording is not guaranteed. The individual involved in the Leno incident appeared, based on what could be observed of the confrontation, to be attempting communication rather than attack. Her movements and apparent focus during the engagement seemed oriented toward being heard rather than toward causing harm. This assessment may be incorrect. It was not possible to interact with her directly, but the impression persists. That is all. The Jedi Knight who wrote this did not forward it, did not escalate it, did not attach it to any formal report or flag it for council attention. They filed it with their personal field notes, which were archived with everything else from the period, and the notation sat in that archive undisturbed. The impression persists. 4 words that contain the entire tragedy of what happened in Corridor 3. Someone was close enough to the situation to notice that she was trying to be heard, and wrote it down privately and said nothing. Why did they say nothing? The narrator cannot know with certainty, but the shape of the available explanations suggests several possibilities, none of them malicious, and all of them sufficient to produce the same outcome. The most likely is the simplest. By the time the Jedi Knight could have escalated the observation, the situation was already resolved. She was dead. The Imperial operative Teneb Kel had already left the station. The mission, from the Empire's perspective, was complete. What would escalating the observation have accomplished? It would have raised questions about a situation that was already closed. It would have required explaining the basis of the impression, which was subjective and not grounded in direct interaction. It would have generated paperwork and inquiry around an incident that the official framing on both sides had already categorized as resolved. The impression was real, but the situation was over, and writing it privately, filing it with personal notes, was a way of honoring the impression without opening a question that the institutional environment of the moment was not positioned to answer. This is how important information disappears. Not through suppression, not through active destruction, through the entirely reasonable assessment made by a reasonable person in a reasonable institutional context that the moment for action has passed and the documentation of what was noticed is the best available option. The notation sat in the archive. The impression persisted in the notation. And the question it contained, was she trying to be heard, went unasked in any official forum for the entire subsequent period. Now, trace what that unanswered question cost. Not immediately. The immediate cost is already visible. She died before she could deliver what she was carrying. The holocron went into Teneb Kel's pocket. The knowledge leaked into Republic awareness only in fragments. The immediate cost is already accounted for in this record. The longer cost is harder to see because it is not a single event. It is an accumulation, a series of moments spread across years in which the galaxy's incomplete understanding of what had happened on Leno Station caused it to misread subsequent information in ways that compounded the original error. The intelligence thread that Exal Kressh had started the document trail, the archivist's notation, the preliminary briefing about the Emperor's conditioning program reached the people it reached with a critical piece of context missing. It arrived as anonymous pattern rather than traceable origin, and without the origin, the pattern was difficult to weight correctly. Consider the Jedi Council member who read the preliminary briefing and set it down with that expression, the expression of someone watching a door close on a fear they had hoped to dismiss. Assessment ongoing. Further intelligence required before action is warranted. If that council member had known what the briefing's existence actually meant, that someone had died to start the chain that produced it, that the Emperor's most comprehensively prepared vessel had broken from her conditioning specifically because the conditioning had shown her too clearly what it was for, that the knowledge in the chain was not fragmentary intelligence gathered from the outside, but first-hand understanding from the inside, the assessment might have been different. Further intelligence required is what you say when the information seems partial and unverifiable. It is not what you say when you understand that the information exists because someone accepted death to put it there. The context would have changed the weight. The weight would have changed the urgency. The urgency might have changed what happened next. The record did not correct itself. Records rarely do. A categorization established at the moment of highest institutional investment in a particular conclusion has enormous persistence. The momentum of official documentation is not neutral. Early framings shape later interpretation in ways that become self-reinforcing. The Empire's categorization shaped how Tenebkel's mission was framed. The mission framing shaped how the Jedi profile was built. The profile shaped how the incident was processed on the Republic side. The processing shaped how the intelligence thread was weighted when it arrived in official channels. Each step in the chain produced the next step correctly, given the information available at that step. The error was at the beginning. And errors at the beginning, in institutional records, do not get corrected by the later steps going well. They get carried forward. They accumulate. They become the foundation on which subsequent accurate processing is built, which means the subsequent processing is accurate relative to an inaccurate foundation. The narrator cannot correct the record. This account is not an official document. It will not be filed in any Imperial or Republic archive. It will not be cross-referenced against the original categorization and used to produce an amended finding. The record will remain what it is: sealed, classified, built on the framing the Dark Council chose in the hours after Tenebkel confirmed the mission complete. What this account can do is show the shape of what the record got wrong. Not to assign blame, the narrator has no interest in blame. And the account has made clear that most of what happened was the product of ordinary institutional processes operating on incomplete information rather than deliberate wrongdoing by identifiable individuals. But to sit with the shape of the loss, the wrong question was asked about her. The wrong framing was applied. And 40-some years later, the galaxy is still living inside the consequences of a categorization produced in a few hours by people who had already decided what it needed to say. She was not a failed vessel. She was not a threat neutralized. She was someone who understood something that almost no one else in the galaxy had access to, who made a specific and costly choice about what to do with that understanding, who ran toward the only people she thought could use it, and who died before she could finish saying what she was trying to say. The record calls her a traitor. The impression persists that she was trying to be heard. Both of these things are in the archive. Only one of them is in the official record, and that is the mistake. That is the mistake that became a record. That is the mistake the galaxy has been living with ever since. We are back at the station. Not for the first time in this account. We have been here before, at the beginning, when the corridor was still a mystery, and the stain on the floor was still something we were approaching rather than something we understood. But this time is different. This time, we arrive carrying everything the previous 9 chapters have placed in our hands: the names, the objects, the decisions, the gaps, the things that were said and the things that were not said, and the things that were filed in archives that nobody has opened in 11 years. We arrive knowing who she was, and knowing who she was changes what the station feels like. In the first chapter, the corridor felt like a mystery, a place where something significant had happened that nobody would explain. The dockworker's description, the room where someone was interrupted in the middle of saying something important, felt like the beginning of a question. We did not know what question. We only knew the weight of it, the particular atmospheric pressure of a place that is holding something it has not been permitted to release. Now we know what question. Now the corridor feels like aftermath. This is a different quality of feeling. Mystery has an open quality. It reaches forward. It pulls you toward the explanation you do not yet have. Aftermath has a closed quality, but not a resolved one. Aftermath is the specific weight of understanding what happened without being able to change it. It is heavier than mystery in some ways and lighter in others. Heavier because the knowledge is real and cannot be unknown. Lighter because the not knowing is over, and not knowing has its own particular exhaustion that resolves when understanding finally arrives. We are standing in Corridor 3 of the mid-ring residential block on Leno Station, and we understand what happened here. And understanding it does not make the stain on the floor smaller. It makes the stain on the floor mean something. The Force does not forget. This is not a mystical claim in the way that mystical claims are sometimes dismissed as the kind of thing that sounds significant but points toward nothing verifiable. It is a description of something that Force-sensitive individuals have documented consistently across the entire history of the Jedi Order's interaction with significant locations. Places where important things happened retain something. Not a recording, not a playback that shows the event to anyone sensitive enough to perceive it. Something quieter than that. Something more, like the quality that wood holds after fire has touched it, or the quality that stone holds after centuries of water have moved through it. A texture, a resonance. The particular feeling of a place that has been used for something that mattered. The Jedi have specific language for this. They distinguish between active Force presences, places where the Force is being generated or focused by something currently operating, and residual Force impressions, places where something significant occurred and left. A trace in the fabric of the location that persists after the generating event is long finished. Leno Station's mid-ring residential block, Corridor 3. Is a residual impression site. This is not the narrator's assessment. It is the documented experience of at least 4 Force-sensitive individuals who passed through Leno Station in the years following the incident, none of whom knew what had happened there, none of whom were looking for anything, all of whom noted, in various forms of personal record, an unusual quality in that section of the station that they could not explain through environmental factors. The notes vary in their precision. One describes it as a disturbance in the Force that felt unresolved, like a conversation that had been cut off before reaching its conclusion. One describes it as urgency without object, the feeling of needing to do something immediately without any accompanying sense of what that something was. One writes only that the corridor felt like it was still in the middle of something, which is an imprecise description but not an inaccurate one. The fourth description is the one the narrator finds most precise. A Jedi healer traveling through the Leno system on unrelated business, stopping at the station for resupply, walking through the mid-ring on the way to the supply depot, stopped in Corridor 3 without intending to stop. Stood there for a moment. Wrote afterward, in the notes she kept about Force-sensitive experiences during travel, that the location felt like someone had been trying very hard to say something and had not been allowed to finish. She wrote that the incompleteness of it was the most prominent quality. Not the darkness, she noted that the Force impression was not particularly dark in its character. Not grief, exactly. Not residual pain in the way that sites of violence sometimes carry pain. Urgency. That was her word. The place still felt urgent. 43 years after a fight that lasted approximately 4 minutes, the corridor where Exal Kressh died was still radiating the urgency of what she had been trying to do when she died doing it. The Force does not only hold what happened in a place. Sometimes it holds what was intended. This is a more speculative claim, and the narrator makes it carefully. The Jedi scholarship on residual Force impressions does not have a clear consensus on whether intention the purpose behind an action. The goal that the actor was oriented toward when the significant event occurred leaves a separate trace from the event itself. Some scholars argue that intention is inseparable from action in Force terms, that what someone was trying to do is part of what happened, and therefore part of what the Force records. Others argue that only the event itself leaves an impression, and that any sense of intention that Force-sensitive individuals perceive at such sites is their own interpretive overlay rather than something the location is actually communicating. The narrator does not have the expertise to resolve this debate, but the narrator notes that the quality the Jedi healer described, urgency without object, the feeling of something important attempted and not finished, is more consistent with an impression of intention than with an impression of event. The event was a fight. Fights leave residues, but the residues of violence tend toward different qualities than urgency. They tend toward pain or darkness, or the particular frozen quality of a moment of extremity. Urgency implies direction. Urgency implies that something was reaching toward a destination that it did not reach. What Exal Kressh was reaching toward in Corridor 3, in the 4 minutes the fight lasted, was not the fight itself. She was reaching toward the delivery. She was still trying, in whatever capacity the situation permitted, to move the knowledge she was carrying toward somewhere it could be used. The fight was an obstacle between her and that destination. The 4 minutes were not 4 minutes of combat. In the pure sense, they were 4 minutes of someone trying to do two things simultaneously, fighting to stay alive long enough to say what needed to be said, while fighting someone who had been sent specifically to prevent her from saying it. The urgency in the corridor is the impression of that two-directional effort. She was trying to finish the sentence. The sentence did not finish. The urgency remained. From Leno Station, the narrator moves to Tython. Not physically, the narrator is not traveling between these locations in any literal sense. But the account moves there, follows the thread from the station where she died to the archive, where what she was carrying currently sits, traces the connection between the place that still holds her urgency and the object that still holds her knowledge. The Jedi Temple on Tython is a different kind of place from Leno Station. Where Leno Station is a structure of practical function built for commerce and transit, and the ordinary movement of people and goods through space, the Jedi Temple on Tython was built with intention toward the Force from its foundations. It sits on a world that the Jedi have understood as significant to the Force for longer than the current iteration of the Order has existed. The ground itself has been in relationship with Force-sensitive individuals and with the Force they channel for generations. The temple has been the site of training, of study, of meditation, of the specific ongoing practice of people orienting themselves towards something larger than themselves. It holds a great deal. The archive within it holds a different kind of holding, not the active, ongoing resonance of a living institution, the particular stillness of accumulated records, the quality that repositories of knowledge develop when they have been receiving material for long enough that the material itself begins to constitute something, not a collection exactly, more like a conversation that has been going on for so long that the participants have changed many times, but the conversation has not stopped. Somewhere in that archive, in a room that has been sealed for 11 years, on a shelf in the dark, SR 774 is still waiting. The narrator wants to describe this simply, not with drama, not with the weight of revelation, because the revelation is not new. The listener has known about the holocron since Chapter 2, has followed it through 6 pairs of hands, has understood what it carries and what it has not yet been permitted to deliver. The narrator does not need to announce what the object is or why it matters. What the narrator wants to do is simply see it. Small, hexagonal, dark red crystal matrix, the color of something that was once bright and has aged into something deeper. The gatekeeper mechanism corrupted, non-functional, the standard interface by which a Sith holocron speaks to those who seek to access it essentially silent. The data storage intact. The narrator cannot know this with absolute certainty, given that the device has not been examined in 11 years and was not fully assessed before that. But the physical condition of the device, as last described, suggested no deterioration of the storage matrix. And there is no reason to believe the 11 years of dark and climate-controlled archival conditions have done damage that warmer, less stable environments during its travel did not. What Exal Kressh put inside it is still inside it. The conditioning protocols, the partial records of what the Emperor was building his children toward, the evidence she assembled on Dromund Kaas and carried across Republic space, and protected through weeks of pursuit, and was still carrying in the last 4 minutes of her life. It is in the dark. It has been in the dark for a long time. The archive room is sealed. The shelf holds other objects, other accumulated fragments of other stories that also wait for the attention that has not yet arrived. The room itself has that quality, that sealed rooms develop a stillness that is not peaceful exactly, more like hell. Like the room is aware, in whatever way rooms can be aware, that it has not been opened in a long time, and is not certain when it will be opened again. The narrator sits with this image for a moment, does not dramatize it, does not suggest that the object glows or calls out, or radiates significance in ways that a passing force-sensitive individual would notice through the sealed door. It does not do any of those things. It is a small hexagonal object on a shelf in the dark. It is carrying something important. Nobody who currently knows it exists is looking for it, because nobody who currently knows it exists knows what it contains. This is not a tragedy in the dramatic sense. It is a tragedy in the ordinary sense. The kind that accumulates quietly in archives and sealed rooms and classified records across decades, invisible until someone happens to look in the right place at the right time, and suddenly the accumulated weight of it is visible all at once. The object is still there. What Exal Kressh died trying to deliver is still there, waiting with the patience of an object, which is to say completely and without any awareness of the waiting, and therefore without any hope of the waiting ending, but also without any despair about it. It simply is. In the dark. Now the narrator must return to the question. The listener has been carrying it since Chapter 2, when it was first named. The listener has carried it through everything that followed through the chase and the fight, and the holocron's journey, and Thanitin's career, and the mythology that replaced the person, and the mistake that became a record. The listener has carried it the way the listener carries all the significant questions in this account, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a weight to be held, a shape to be understood through what surrounds it, even when the center of it remains unexamined. The question is this: did she know she was not going to survive? Not in the general sense, not the abstract awareness that anyone running from the Empire accepts when they make the decision to run, in the specific sense. In those final weeks, moving through Republic space in the pattern that Teneb Kell himself noted, looked more like reaching a destination than escaping a pursuer, did Exal Kressh understand. At some level, she may not have articulated even to herself that she was not going to make it to the destination. And if she did understand that if the acceptance of the cost had happened somewhere in those weeks, quietly, without announcement, in the way that certain kinds of understanding settle into a person without drama, then what does that change about what she was doing? Because The route she took was not the route of someone trying to survive. It was the route of someone trying to be seen, trying to generate enough signal, enough noise, enough visible movement through the right kinds of spaces, that even if she did not reach the destination herself, the attempt would leave traces, would leak into the awareness of people who were paying attention, would put threads into the galaxy's understanding that would pull, eventually, in the direction of the truth she was carrying. She seeded it. Every stop she made, every route change, every moment of her passage through Republic space that was recorded by someone who did not know what they were recording, she seeded it. The operative in the cantina on Leno station. The elevated force signal that the Jedi scout noticed. The pattern in the data that an analyst would eventually pull into a dataset and label with a phrase that contained the beginning of an understanding. She seeded all of it, not through deliberate strategy that we can document, but through the simple fact of being visible in the right places in the right way. Was that intentional? Did she know, when she chose the route she chose, that it would leave traces even if she did not survive to deliver the knowledge directly? The narrator cannot answer this. The narrator has spent this entire account being honest about what can be known and what cannot, and this is the place where that honesty is most costly. Because this is the question that determines whether Exal Kresh's death was a failure or a sacrifice, whether she died before she could finish what she was trying to do, or whether she finished it in the only way that was still available to her through the noise of the attempt itself. Both are possible. Both are consistent with the evidence. And the only person who knows which is true is not available to say. Thanitin is gone. He died in the circumstances his career had prepared him for, defeated by someone who carried none of his refusals, undone in ways that the hollow at the center of his carefully constructed identity made possible. He carried his not knowing to his grave, which means he carried to his grave the only first-hand account of what Exal Kressh said in Corridor 3 before the fight ended. Whatever she said in those 4 minutes, whatever words she used to try, one final time, to make the person in front of her understand what was at stake, died in that corridor and was carried by Teneb Kel for the rest of his life, in the specific form of everything he refused to think about. He is gone now. The not knowing went with him. The narrator notes this without judgment. The narrator has spent this entire account declining to assign final judgment to any of the people inside it, because final judgment requires certainty about motives and circumstances and internal states that the record does not provide, and that the narrator is not willing to invent. Teneb Kel made choices. Those choices had consequences. The consequences are visible in the record. What was happening inside him when he made those choices, the full weight of what he understood and what he refused to understand, and why he made the specific decisions he made rather than different ones, that is not available. It died with him. The question died with him. And the listener, who has been carrying the question since Chapter 2, must now set it down without it having been answered. This is the honest ending. Not because it is satisfying, it is not satisfying, and the narrator acknowledges this plainly. The listener has spent hours with this account and has earned an answer. The question deserves an answer. Exal Kressh deserved to have the question about her intentions treated with the seriousness it warranted. Examined carefully, answered by someone with access to the relevant information. She did not receive that. The question was never asked officially, in any context where the asking might have led to an answer. It was asked only here, in this account, assembled from fragments and gaps, and the shapes that absences make when you line them up and look at them from the right angle. And here, without Teneb Kel alive to say what he heard, without Exal Kressh available to say what she intended, the question remains exactly what it was when it was first named. Unanswerable. Not unspeakable. The narrator has spoken it multiple times in multiple ways. Not unimportant. It may be the most important question in this entire account. Simply unanswerable in the honest sense of that word. Without the information that would be required to answer it, and without any prospect of that information becoming available. The narrator sets it down, not with relief, not with frustration, with the particular care that you use when you set down something fragile deliberately, gently, aware that the setting down is a choice, and that the object being set down deserves to be set down with intention rather than simply dropped. There is a fragment. The narrator has been imagining it across this account without stating that explicitly until now. A piece of the floor from Corridor 3 of Leno Station's mid-ring residential block. Not an actual fragment. The narrator has not been to Leno Station, has not removed material from the site, is not holding a physical object. But, as a way of thinking about what this account has been doing the work of excavation, of brushing dust off something buried, and not always knowing what shape will emerge. The narrator has been holding an imagined fragment of the floor throughout the carbon composite material. Dark red at the edge of it, where the stain reached. The warmth of it, which is imagined too, but which persists in the imagining with a specific stubborn quality of things that refuse to be entirely fictional. Old stone should not be warm. This fragment is not warm because the incident was recent. 43 years is not recent. It is warm in the imagining because of what the Force holds in places where significant things happened, the residual impression, the urgency without object, the feeling of something important attempted and not finished. The fragment carries a trace of that in the imagining. It has been warm the whole time. The narrator sets it down now, carefully. The way you set down something that has been in your hands for a long time and that has shaped, through the holding of it, the specific way your hands feel when they are empty. You do not drop it. You do not place it carelessly. You find a surface that seems right level, stable, somewhere the thing will not be immediately disturbed, and you lower it deliberately, and you open your hands, and you let it rest. The imagined fragment rests. The stain at its edge is still there. The warmth in it, which was never a physical warmth and was always an imagined one, persists for a moment after the setting down, the way warmth lingers in the shape of a hand after the hand has moved away. And then the narrator walks away. The station keeps its silence. The gas giant below it turns in its slow, enormous way, amber and pale green, and something almost white at the highest cloud layers, patterns moving in cycles that take years to complete. The station rotates above it. The viewports in the mid-ring catch the light from below in their regular intervals, filling the corridors with something soft and old, and indifferent to the specific histories of specific people who lived and moved and died inside the structure, floating above the turning planet. Corridor 3 is empty. It is almost always empty at this hour. The floor holds what it absorbed 43 years ago. The warped panel sits above the stain, doing the work it was installed to do, which is to prevent anyone from seeing directly what is underneath, which is the discoloration that cleaning never removed, which is the physical record of what happened in this space on the day something significant occurred that no official document will confirm occurred at all. The Force holds the urgency. The archive on Thanitin holds the holocron. The record holds the wrong version of her. And somewhere in the gap between all of these holdings, between the urgency that the corridor still radiates, and the knowledge that the object still carries, and the myth that the record still preserves somewhere in that gap. The actual person still exists, not as a ghost, not as a presence in any force-sensitive sense, because that is not how people persist after death. As the shape of what she left behind, as the specific pattern of consequences that her choices generated and that are still propagating through the galaxy in ways that no one has yet fully mapped. She ran toward the people who might have listened. She almost reached them. She left traces that are still in the galaxy. She died thinking she had failed completely. The narrator cannot tell her she was wrong about that. She is not here to be told. But the narrator can note carefully, without overstating it, with the specific honesty that this entire account has tried to maintain about the difference between what is known and what is hoped, that the chain she started is still in the galaxy, still moving, still pulling, very slowly, in the direction of the truth she was carrying. The thread is still there. It has not been found yet, not in any complete sense. Not by anyone who has been able to trace it back to her and understand where it started and what it cost to put it there. But threads do not disappear simply because no one is currently holding them. They wait. In archives, in the residual impressions of places, in the specific shape of a career built around refusing to examine one thing, in a small hexagonal object on a shelf, in a sealed room on Thanitin. They wait with the patience of things that have no awareness of waiting, and the galaxy moves around them, not knowing they are there, not knowing that the person who put them there accepted the cost of putting them there before the cost was paid, running toward the only destination that gave the knowledge somewhere to go. The station keeps its silence. It has been keeping it for 43 years. It is very good at this now. The gas giant turns. The corridor holds its breath. The fragment, set down carefully on an imagined surface, is still faintly warm.